Genesis chapter 24 verse 1. And Abraham was old, and well stricken in age, and the Lord had blessed Abraham in all things. This verse marks an important turning point in the book of Genesis. It sets the stage for the narrative of finding a wife for Isaac, Abraham's son. Here are some key points to consider. Abraham's age. The verse begins by highlighting Abraham's advanced age, stating that he was old and well stricken in age. This emphasizes that Abraham was in the later years of his life, making it crucial to secure a suitable wife for Isaac to ensure the continuation of God's covenant. The Lord's blessing. The verse mentions that the Lord had blessed Abraham in all things. This statement reflects the faithfulness of God in fulfilling his promises to Abraham. Throughout Abraham's life, God had been with him, guiding, protecting, and prospering him in various ways. God's blessings encompassed not only material wealth but also spiritual blessings and the fulfillment of his covenant promises. The context. Genesis chapter 24 presents the account of Abraham's servant, likely Eliezer of Damascus, mentioned in Genesis chapter 15 verse 2, being sent to find a wife for Isaac among Abraham's relatives in Mesopotamia. Abraham wanted to ensure that Isaac would not marry a Canaanite woman, but instead, a woman who worshipped the Lord, the God of Abraham. Historical and symbolic significance. This verse serves as a reminder of God's faithfulness in keeping his promises to Abraham, which included the blessing of descendants who would become a great nation, Genesis chapter 12 verses 2 and 3. It also underscores the significance of the chosen lineage through which the Messiah, Jesus Christ, would eventually come. As we explore this verse, we witness God's providential hand at work in Abraham's life. The fulfillment of God's promises hinged upon finding the right wife for Isaac, ensuring the continuation of the chosen lineage. This account further demonstrates the importance of seeking God's guidance and remaining faithful to his covenant, even in matters as personal as marriage. Genesis chapter 24 verse 1 serves as a reminder that God is intimately involved in the details of our lives and his plans for us. It encourages us to trust in his faithfulness, even in our old age or seasons of uncertainty, knowing that he has a purpose and a plan that extends beyond our limited understanding. Genesis chapter 24 verse 2. And Abraham said unto his eldest servant of his house, that ruled over all that he had, Put, I pray thee, thy hand under my thigh. This verse is part of the narrative in Genesis where Abraham, who is advanced in age, wants to find a suitable wife for his son Isaac. In this verse, Abraham addresses his eldest servant, who is in charge of all his possessions, and asks him to do something significant in order to seal a solemn oath. The phrase, Put, I pray thee, thy hand under my thigh, might seem unusual or even perplexing to modern readers. However, in the cultural context of the time, it was a customary practice that carried deep significance. Placing one's hand under another's thigh was a symbolic act representing the taking of a solemn oath or making a binding agreement. Abraham, aware of the importance of finding a suitable wife for Isaac from their own people rather than the Canaanites, wants to ensure that the servant carries out his task faithfully and diligently. By asking him to swear an oath, Abraham is emphasizing the seriousness of the servant's mission and his commitment to fulfill it according to Abraham's instructions. This act of placing the hand under the thigh was likely a cultural practice specific to that time and context, and it is not a practice that carries over into modern times or other cultures. It is important to interpret biblical passages within their historical and cultural context to understand their intended meaning. In the subsequent verses of Genesis chapter 24, Abraham instructs his servant to journey to his homeland and find a wife for Isaac among his relatives. The servant is given specific instructions and guidance regarding how to identify the chosen woman, and he undertakes this task with great determination and reliance on God's guidance. Genesis chapter 24 verse 2 serves as a starting point for the narrative, establishing the context and highlighting the significance of the servant's mission to find a wife for Isaac. It demonstrates Abraham's commitment to fulfilling God's promise of a great nation through his descendants and his desire to ensure that Isaac marries someone who shares their faith and heritage. As we continue reading Genesis chapter 24, we see God's faithfulness in guiding the servant to Rebekah, who becomes Isaac's wife and an integral part of the lineage leading to Jesus Christ. This chapter showcases God's providential hand in orchestrating events and fulfilling his promises. Genesis chapter 24 verse 3, "And I will make thee swear by the Lord, the God of heaven, and the God of the earth, that thou shalt not take a wife unto my son of the daughters of the Canaanites, among whom I dwell." Context: Genesis chapter 24 recounts the story of Abraham sending his servant to find a wife for his son, Isaac. Abraham was getting old, and he wanted to ensure that Isaac would have a suitable wife from their own people and not from the Canaanites among whom they lived. Swearing by the Lord. In this verse, Abraham instructs his servant to swear by the Lord, the God of heaven and earth. By making the servant take an oath in the name of God, Abraham emphasizes the seriousness and importance of finding a wife for Isaac from the right lineage. This underscores the significance of maintaining the spiritual and cultural heritage of their family. Avoiding intermarriage. Abraham specifically instructs his servant not to take a wife for Isaac from among the Canaanites. This instruction reflects the concern to preserve the distinct identity and faith of God's chosen people. The Canaanites were a pagan people, and intermarriage with them could lead to the corruption of the faith and the introduction of idolatry. Obedience and faithfulness. Abraham's instruction to his servant demonstrates his obedience and faithfulness to God's covenant. Abraham understood the importance of raising Isaac in a family that shared their faith and values. By seeking a wife for Isaac from their own people, Abraham ensured the continuation of God's promise and the preservation of their heritage. Application. While this verse speaks to a specific situation in the life of Abraham and Isaac, it carries some timeless principles for believers today. It reminds us of the significance of marrying within the faith and being mindful of the spiritual implications of our choices. It also encourages us to be intentional about preserving and passing on our values and faith to the next generation. Overall, Genesis chapter 24 verse 3 teaches us about the importance of faithfulness, obedience to God's commands, and the significance of maintaining our spiritual heritage. It highlights the value of making choices that align with God's purposes and staying committed to His covenant. Genesis chapter 24 verse 4, "But thou shalt go unto my country, and to my kindred, and take a wife unto my son Isaac." This verse is part of the narrative in Genesis chapter 24 where Abraham, the father of Isaac, instructs his servant to find a wife for his son. Let's explore the context and significance of this verse in a brief Bible study. Context. In the preceding chapters of Genesis, God made a covenant with Abraham, promising him a son and numerous descendants who would inherit the land of Canaan. This promise was fulfilled when Sarah, Abraham's wife, gave birth to Isaac, who was the long-awaited child of promise. Now, in Genesis chapter 24, Isaac is a grown man, and Abraham desires to secure a suitable wife for him. Abraham's instruction. In Genesis chapter 24 chapter 4, Abraham instructs his servant to go back to his homeland, to the country and kindred from which Abraham himself had come. The purpose is to find a wife for Isaac from among Abraham's own relatives, rather than from the Canaanites among whom they now dwell. This instruction reveals Abraham's concern for preserving the faith and heritage of his family line. Abraham's motivation. Abraham's primary concern is finding a wife who would be faithful to God and would continue the legacy of faith that he and Sarah had established. He wanted Isaac's wife to come from his own kindred, presumably because they would share a common culture, belief system, and understanding of God. This desire reflects the importance Abraham placed on passing down the spiritual inheritance to future generations. Symbolism. Abraham's instructions in this verse also carry symbolic significance. Abraham is often seen as a representative of God the Father, while Isaac symbolizes Jesus Christ. In this context, The servant who is sent to find a bride for Isaac can be seen as representing the work of the Holy Spirit, who is sent to gather the church, the bride, for Christ. This foreshadows the union of Christ and his church in the New Testament. Application: Genesis chapter 24 verse 4 teaches us several valuable lessons. First, it emphasizes the significance of choosing a life partner who shares our faith and values. Abraham's concern for finding a wife from his kindred highlights the importance of seeking a spouse who will support and contribute to our spiritual journey. Secondly, the passage underscores the responsibility of passing down our faith to future generations. Like Abraham, we should be intentional about nurturing faith within our families and seeking godly companions for our children. Lastly, the verse foreshadows the redemptive plan of God through Christ. Just as the servant was sent to find a suitable bride for Isaac, the Holy Spirit is at work gathering believers to form the church, the bride of Christ. In conclusion, Genesis chapter 24 verse 4 captures Abraham's instructions to find a wife for Isaac from his own kindred. This verse highlights the importance of finding a spouse who shares our faith, passing down our spiritual heritage, and symbolically points to the work of the Holy Spirit in gathering the church for Christ. Genesis chapter 24 verse 5. And the servant said unto him, Peradventure the woman will not be willing to follow me unto this land. Must I needs bring thy son again unto the land from whence thou camest? Context: Genesis chapter 24 recounts the story of Abraham sending his servant to find a wife for his son, Isaac. In this verse, the servant expresses concern about whether the woman he finds will be willing to leave her homeland and accompany him back to Canaan to marry Isaac. Faith and obedience. Abraham's servant, who remains unnamed in the passage, displays faith and obedience to his master's command. He is concerned about finding the right woman for Isaac and fulfilling his duty faithfully. Trust in God's guidance. Abraham's servant recognizes the possibility that the woman might refuse to follow him. However, he trusts in God's guidance and provision throughout his journey. This trust is evident in the subsequent verses as the servant seeks God's intervention and guidance in finding the right woman. God's sovereignty. The servant's question about whether he should bring Isaac back to the land from which Abraham came reveals his awareness of God's sovereignty and the covenant God had established with Abraham. He understands that God's plan for Isaac's wife is tied to the promised land. Spiritual application. This passage reminds us of the importance of faith, obedience, and trust in God's guidance in our own lives. Like Abraham's servant, we are called to trust God's sovereignty and follow his leading, even when faced with uncertainties or potential challenges. Marriage and God's plan. This passage also highlights the significance of marriage in God's plan. Abraham's servant is sent on a specific mission to find a wife for Isaac, ensuring the continuation of God's covenant through the next generation. It emphasizes the importance of seeking God's will in our own relationships and marriages, trusting that He has a plan for our lives. God's faithfulness. Throughout the story, we see God's faithfulness in fulfilling His promises. He guides the servant to Rebekah, who becomes Isaac's wife and plays a significant role in the lineage of Jesus Christ. This serves as a reminder of God's faithfulness in orchestrating events for His purposes, even in our lives today. In conclusion, Genesis chapter 24 verse 5 demonstrates the servant's faith, obedience, and trust in God's guidance. It encourages us to trust in God's sovereignty, seek His will in our relationships, and recognize His faithfulness in fulfilling His promises. Genesis chapter 24 verse 6. And Abraham said unto him, Beware thou that thou bring not my son thither again. This verse is part of the narrative in Genesis chapter 24, where Abraham sends his servant to find a wife for his son, Isaac. The servant is tasked with the responsibility of going to Abraham's homeland and finding a suitable wife from among his relatives rather than allowing Isaac to marry a Canaanite woman. In Genesis chapter 24 verse 6, Abraham is instructing his servant to be cautious and careful not to allow his son, Isaac, to return to Abraham's homeland. The verse reflects Abraham's concern for his son's spiritual heritage and the continuation of the covenant God made with him. Abraham's instruction carries a deeper significance, as it reveals his commitment to keeping his family separate from the influences of the pagan Canaanite culture. The Canaanites were known for their idolatry and wicked practices, and Abraham wanted to ensure that Isaac's wife would come from a family dedicated to worshipping the true God. This verse also demonstrates Abraham's faith and trust in God's guidance. He believed that God would provide a suitable wife for Isaac, and he entrusted the task to his servant, who would seek divine guidance in finding the right woman. Abraham's faith is evident in his conviction that God would fulfill his promises and bless Isaac with a wife who shared their faith and devotion. In a broader context, this verse teaches us the importance of being mindful of the spiritual well-being of our children and loved ones. It encourages us to make deliberate choices that safeguard their faith and help them grow in their relationship with God. Abraham's concern for Isaac's future and his commitment to finding a wife from a godly lineage can serve as an example for us to prioritize spiritual values in our own families. Furthermore, this verse reminds us of God's faithfulness in fulfilling his promises. Abraham's trust in God's guidance and provision is a testimony to God's unwavering commitment to his people. Just as Abraham believed God would provide the right wife for Isaac, we too can trust in God's faithfulness as we seek his guidance and provision in our lives. In conclusion, Genesis chapter 24 verse 6 captures Abraham's caution to his servant in finding a wife for Isaac and emphasizes the importance of preserving their spiritual heritage. It highlights Abraham's faith in God's guidance and encourages us to prioritize spiritual values in our own families, trusting in God's faithfulness in fulfilling his promises. Genesis chapter 24 verse 7. The Lord God of heaven, which took me from my father's house, and from the land of my kindred, and which spake unto me, and that sware unto me, saying, Unto thy seed will I give this land. He shall send his angel before thee, and thou shalt take a wife unto my son from thence. This verse is part of the account where Abraham sends his servant to find a wife for his son Isaac. The servant is instructed by Abraham to go to Abraham's homeland to find a suitable wife from among his relatives, rather than from the Canaanites among whom they were dwelling. Let's break down the verse to gain a deeper understanding. The Lord God of heaven. This phrase highlights that Abraham acknowledges God as the supreme ruler over all creation, emphasizing his divine authority and sovereignty. Abraham's faith in God's guidance is crucial in this context. Which took me from my father's house, and from the land of my kindred. Abraham recalls how God called him to leave his father's house and his native land, Ur of the Chaldeans, Genesis chapter 12 verse 1. This emphasizes God's initiative in choosing and leading Abraham, highlighting the personal relationship between them. Which spake unto me, and that sware unto me. Here, Abraham reflects on God's promise to him. God not only spoke to Abraham but also made an oath, confirming his commitment to fulfilling his promise. This demonstrates God's faithfulness and establishes the credibility of the promise. Unto thy seed will I give this land. This is a restatement of the promise that God made to Abraham on several occasions. God pledged to give the land of Canaan to Abraham's descendants as an everlasting possession, Genesis chapter 12 verse 7, Genesis chapter 13 verse 15, Genesis chapter 15 verse 18. He shall send his angel before thee. Abraham assures his servant that God will send his angel ahead of him to guide him and facilitate the successful completion of his mission. This demonstrates Abraham's confidence in God's divine intervention and assistance. Thou shalt take a wife unto my son from thence. The primary purpose of the servant's journey is to find a wife for Isaac from Abraham's kindred. Abraham wants to ensure that Isaac's wife comes from the same lineage of faith and avoids the Canaanite customs and idolatry. This verse showcases Abraham's unwavering trust in God's guidance and his faithfulness in fulfilling his promises. Abraham's reliance on God's intervention and his commitment to preserving the faith lineage in Isaac's marriage serve as powerful lessons for believers today. It encourages us to trust in God's leading, to remember his promises, and to seek godly relationships that align with our faith. By studying this verse, we can gain insights into the faith and obedience of Abraham, the character of God, and the importance of maintaining spiritual values in significant life decisions. Genesis chapter 24 verse 8. And if the woman will not be willing to follow thee, then thou shalt be clear from this my oath, only bring not my son thither again. Context: Genesis chapter 24 is the account of Abraham's servant seeking a wife for Isaac. Abraham instructed his servant to go to his homeland and find a wife for his son from among his relatives, rather than from the Canaanites. This verse is part of Abraham's instructions to his servant. God's covenant. Abraham's concern was that his son Isaac would not marry a woman from the Canaanites, who were a people with different religious and cultural practices. Abraham desired a wife for his son who would be part of the covenant people of God. This passage reflects Abraham's commitment to preserving the religious heritage and faithfulness to God's covenant. Willingness. Abraham told his servant that if the woman he found was unwilling to follow him back to Canaan, then he would be released from the oath he made to Abraham. This highlights the importance of the woman's willingness to participate in God's plan. It reveals the value of a person's volition and choice in matters of faith and obedience. Trust in God. In this verse, Abraham entrusted the success of the mission to God's guidance. He believed that if the woman was not willing to follow, then God would intervene and provide an alternative solution. This demonstrates Abraham's trust in God's sovereignty and his faith that God would orchestrate the circumstances to fulfill his promise. Application. This passage reminds us of the significance of choosing a life partner who shares our faith and values. It emphasizes the importance of seeking God's guidance in relationships and making decisions aligned with His will. It also encourages us to trust in God's providence and sovereignty in all areas of our lives. Overall, Genesis chapter 24 verse 8 portrays Abraham's commitment to God's covenant, his reliance on God's guidance, and the importance of willingness and faith in fulfilling God's purposes. Genesis chapter 24 verse 9. And the servant put his hand under the thigh of Abraham his master, and sware to him concerning that matter. In this verse, we find Abraham's servant, who is not explicitly named but is traditionally believed to be Eliezer of Damascus, making a solemn oath to his master. To understand the significance of this verse, let's examine the context and explore its implications. Genesis chapter 24 narrates the account of Abraham's servant being sent on a mission to find a wife for Isaac, Abraham's son. Abraham was concerned about Isaac marrying a woman from the local Canaanite people because they worshipped idols, so he sent his servant back to his homeland to find a suitable wife among his relatives. In verse 9, the servant demonstrates his commitment and loyalty to Abraham by putting his hand under Abraham's thigh and swearing an oath. This action might seem strange to us today, but in ancient times, it was a customary way of making a solemn oath or binding agreement. Placing the hand under the thigh symbolized a pledge of allegiance, respect, and submission to the authority of the one before whom the oath was being taken. Abraham's servant swore to Abraham concerning that matter, referring to the specific task he was entrusted with, finding a wife for Isaac. By taking this oath, the servant confirmed his dedication to fulfilling his master's command and assured Abraham that he would diligently carry out his duty. This verse highlights several important principles that we can draw from it. Obedience and loyalty. Abraham's servant exemplifies obedience and loyalty by willingly undertaking the task assigned to him. His oath solidified his commitment to follow Abraham's instructions faithfully. Similarly, as followers of God, we are called to be obedient to God's commands and remain loyal to Him. Respect for authority. The act of placing the hand under Abraham's thigh showed reverence and respect for his authority. In our lives, we should demonstrate respect for those in positions of authority, such as parents, teachers, and spiritual leaders, recognizing the wisdom and guidance they can provide. Integrity and honesty. The servant's oath demonstrated his integrity and honesty. By making this solemn pledge, he assured Abraham that he would carry out his mission faithfully and diligently. As believers, we are called to uphold integrity and honesty in all our dealings, honoring our commitments and promises. Trust in God's guidance. This verse is part of the larger narrative of God's faithfulness to Abraham's family and his guidance in their lives. Abraham trusted God's leading in finding a suitable wife for Isaac, and the servant relied on God's guidance throughout his journey. As we study this passage, we can be reminded of the importance of trusting God's leading in our own lives and seeking His wisdom and guidance in all our decisions. Genesis chapter 24 verse 9 provides us with valuable lessons on obedience, loyalty, respect, integrity, and trust in God's guidance. It invites us to reflect on how we can apply these principles in our own lives and relationships. Genesis chapter 24 verse 10. And the servant took 10 camels of the camels of his master, and departed, for all the goods of his master were in his hand, and he arose and went to Mesopotamia, unto the city of Nahor. Context: Genesis chapter 24 records the account of Abraham sending his servant to find a wife for his son Isaac. This verse marks the beginning of the journey of Abraham's servant to Mesopotamia to find a suitable wife from among his relatives. The servant's mission. Abraham's servant is entrusted with the task of finding a wife for Isaac. Abraham instructs him not to choose a wife from the Canaanites but to go to his homeland in Mesopotamia and find a wife from his relatives. This mission was of utmost importance because through Isaac, the covenant promises of God were to be fulfilled. The camels. The servant took 10 camels from his master's herd for his journey. Camels were valuable animals in ancient times and were used for transportation and trade. The mention of the camels highlights the wealth and resources at Abraham's disposal and also indicates that the servant had the means to undertake a long and arduous journey. The goods of his master. The verse states that all the goods of his master were in his hand. This suggests that the servant carried valuable gifts and provisions from Abraham to present to the family of the potential bride. This demonstrates the servant's responsibility and the importance placed on finding a suitable wife for Isaac. The city of Nahor. The servant's destination is the city of Nahor, which was the hometown of Abraham's brother. Abraham desired a wife for Isaac from among his own relatives rather than from the Canaanites. Nahor was located in Mesopotamia, in the region that corresponds to present-day Iraq. This verse sets the stage for the servant's arrival in Nahor and the events that follow. Overall, Genesis chapter 24 verse 10 introduces us to the beginning of the servant's journey to find a wife for Isaac. The passage showcases Abraham's trust in his servant and his commitment to fulfilling God's covenant promises. It also highlights the servant's preparedness, carrying the wealth and goods of his master as he embarks on this important mission. Genesis chapter 24 verse 11. And he made his camels to kneel down without the city by a well of water at the time of the evening, even the time that women go out to draw water. This verse is part of the narrative about Abraham's servant who was sent to find a wife for Isaac, Abraham's son. Let's explore the context and the significance of this verse in the larger story. The story begins in Genesis chapter 24 when Abraham, who was getting old, was concerned about finding a suitable wife for his son Isaac. He didn't want Isaac to marry a Canaanite woman, but rather someone from his own people and his homeland. Abraham entrusted this task to his oldest servant, who is unnamed in the text but is commonly believed to be Eliezer of Damascus. In Genesis chapter 24 verses 10 through 11, the servant embarked on his journey to find a wife for Isaac. He took 10 of Abraham's camels loaded with valuable gifts and traveled to the city of Nahor. When he arrived, he made his camels kneel down near a well outside the city during the evening, at the time when women traditionally came out to draw water. This act of making the camels kneel down by the well was a practical one. Camels are large animals, and it was customary to provide them with a resting place while they were being watered. Making the camels kneel also made it easier for the women who came to draw water to access it from the well. However, this action goes beyond practicality. The servant's choice to position the camels by the well during the evening when women typically came to draw water was strategic. He was looking for a specific sign from God to guide him in finding the right woman for Isaac. In the subsequent verses, Genesis chapter 24 verses 12 through 14, the servant prayed to God, asking for a specific sign. He asked that the woman who would fulfill his request for a drink of water, as well as offer to water his camels, would be the one chosen by God as Isaac's wife. This request was a significant test because watering 10 camels required a considerable amount of effort. The servant's prayer was answered when Rebekah, the daughter of Bethuel, came to the well and fulfilled the servant's request. Her act of kindness and generosity towards a stranger, along with her willingness to go the extra mile by watering the camels, indicated her character and suitability as a wife for Isaac. This confirmation led the servant to praise God for his faithfulness and guidance in fulfilling his mission. Genesis chapter 24 verse 11, therefore, sets the stage for the miraculous encounter between the servant and Rebekah, which ultimately leads to Isaac's marriage. It highlights the servant's wisdom and reliance on God's guidance as he positions himself strategically at the well to find the woman God had chosen. Overall, this verse emphasizes the importance of seeking God's guidance in our lives and the role faith plays in our decision-making processes. It demonstrates how God can orchestrate events in seemingly ordinary circumstances to fulfill his plans and purposes. Genesis chapter 24 verse 12. And he said, O Lord God of my master Abraham, I pray thee, send me good speed this day, and show kindness unto my master Abraham. Genesis chapter 24 recounts the story of how Abraham sent his servant to find a wife for his son Isaac from among his own people rather than from the Canaanites. In this verse, the servant is speaking to God, praying for his guidance and intervention in fulfilling his mission. Seeking divine guidance, the servant addresses God as the Lord God of my master Abraham. He acknowledges God's authority and power, recognizing that he serves Abraham and is acting on his behalf. This demonstrates the servant's faith in God's role as the ultimate authority and his dependence on God's guidance. Praying for success, the servant asks God to send me good speed this day. Here, good speed refers to success, prosperity, or favorable outcomes. The servant desires God's assistance in carrying out his task effectively and successfully. His prayer reveals his reliance on God's providence rather than his own abilities or luck. Seeking favor for Abraham, the servant also requests that God show kindness unto my master Abraham. He prays for God's favor upon Abraham, indicating his concern for his master's well-being. This highlights the servant's loyalty and his desire to fulfill his mission in a way that brings honor and blessings to his master. Lessons from Genesis chapter 24 verse 12. Recognition of God's authority. The servant's prayer emphasizes his acknowledgement of God's authority and his submission to it. Similarly, we should recognize that God is sovereign over our lives and seek his guidance in all our endeavors. Dependence on God. The servant's prayer reflects his dependence on God's intervention for success. It reminds us that we, too, should rely on God rather than our own strength or wisdom. Through prayer, we can seek his guidance and trust him to direct our paths. Concern for others. The servant's request for God's kindness upon Abraham reveals his selflessness and concern for his master's welfare. It teaches us the importance of considering the well-being of others in our prayers and actions, reflecting Christ's love and serving others with genuine care. Faith in God's provision. The servant's prayer demonstrates his faith in God's provision and trust in his ability to bring about favorable outcomes. Likewise, we can approach God with faith, knowing that he is able to answer our prayers according to his perfect will. In summary, Genesis chapter 24 verse 12 showcases the servant's prayer for God's guidance, success, and kindness toward his master Abraham. It highlights the servant's recognition of God's authority, dependence on him, concern for others, and faith in God's provision. These lessons serve as a reminder for us to trust in God, seek his guidance, and prioritize the well-being of others in our prayers and actions. Genesis chapter 24 verse 13. Behold, I stand here by the well of water, and the daughters of the men of the city come out to draw water. This verse is part of the narrative in Genesis chapter 24, which tells the story of Abraham's servant seeking a wife for Isaac. In this particular verse, the servant, whose name is not mentioned, is recounting his encounter with Rebekah, who would eventually become Isaac's wife. To understand the significance of this verse, it is essential to look at the broader context of the chapter. In Genesis chapter 24, Abraham instructs his servant to find a wife for Isaac from among his relatives rather than from the Canaanites. Abraham sends his servant to his homeland, giving him specific instructions on finding a suitable wife. As the servant arrives at the city of Nahor, he stops at a well, which was a common gathering place for women in ancient times. The servant positions himself near the well, where he prays to God, asking for a clear sign to identify the woman destined to be Isaac's wife. He requests that the woman who offers him and his camels water without him asking be the chosen one. In verse 13, the servant declares, "Behold, I stand here by the well of water, and the daughters of the men of the city come out to draw water." This statement sets the stage for the subsequent events that unfold in the story. It emphasizes the cultural practice of women coming to the well to draw water, signifying an opportunity for the servant to meet potential candidates for Isaac's wife. The mentioning of the well is also symbolically significant in the Bible. Throughout the scriptures, wells are often associated with important encounters and divine appointments. In this instance, the well serves as a meeting place where God orchestrates the meeting between the servant and Rebekah. The act of drawing water from the well is a common task assigned to women in ancient times. The servant waits for the women to come to the well because he knows that the woman chosen by God would display a specific act of kindness and generosity. This act would confirm to him that she is the right woman to fulfill his master's request. As the story progresses, Rebekah arrives at the well and fulfills the servant's request by not only offering him water but also watering his camels, displaying great hospitality. Recognizing that God has answered his prayer, the servant blesses God and presents valuable gifts to Rebekah, confirming her as the chosen one. Genesis chapter 24 verse 13 provides an essential backdrop to the story of Isaac and Rebekah, showcasing God's providential guidance in fulfilling Abraham's desire to find a wife for his son from their own people. It highlights the significance of divine appointments and the faithfulness of God in orchestrating events to accomplish his purposes. Genesis chapter 24 verse 14. "And let it come to pass, that the damsel to whom I shall say, Let down thy pitcher, I pray thee, that I may drink. And she shall say, Drink, and I will give thy camels drink also. Let the same be she that thou hast appointed for thy servant Isaac. And thereby shall I know that thou hast showed kindness unto my master." This verse is part of the narrative in Genesis chapter 24, which recounts the story of Abraham's servant seeking a wife for Isaac. Abraham, who was advanced in years, desired to find a suitable wife for his son from among his own people rather than from the surrounding Canaanites. He entrusted this task to his servant, who was faithful and held in high regard. In this verse, the servant devises a plan to determine which woman will be the chosen wife for Isaac. He prays to God, requesting a sign to guide him in selecting the right woman. The sign involves a specific response from a young woman at the well. The servant proposes that if he asks for a drink of water and she willingly provides it, going even further to offer water for his camels as well, then she would be the chosen one. There are a few key themes and lessons we can draw from this verse. Divine guidance. The servant's prayer demonstrates his reliance on God's guidance in making this important decision. He understands the significance of seeking God's will and direction in all matters, even something as personal as choosing a spouse. It serves as a reminder for us to seek God's guidance in all aspects of our lives, including major decisions. Faith and trust. The servant's plan was based on his faith that God would answer his prayer and guide him to the right woman. He trusted in God's faithfulness and believed that God would reveal his plan through the sign he requested. This highlights the importance of having faith in God's promises and trusting in his guidance, even when we face uncertainties in life. God's providence. The servant's plan, which required a very specific response from a woman, might have seemed improbable or coincidental. However, through the servant's faith and God's providence, the events unfolded exactly as planned. This story reminds us that God is actively involved in the details of our lives, orchestrating circumstances and aligning events to fulfill His purposes. Kindness and generosity. The chosen woman would demonstrate kindness and generosity by offering to draw water not only for the servant but also for his camels. This act of going above and beyond what was asked reveals her character and servant-heartedness. It underscores the importance of kindness, generosity, and the willingness to serve others in our own lives. Overall, Genesis chapter 24 verse 14 teaches us about the importance of seeking God's guidance, having faith and trust in His plans, recognizing His providence in our lives, and valuing kindness and generosity. It encourages us to bring our desires and decisions before God, trusting that He will lead us in the right direction. Genesis chapter 24 verse 15. And it came to pass, before he had done speaking, that, behold, Rebekah came out, who was born to Bethuel, son of Milcah, the wife of Nahor, Abraham's brother, with her pitcher upon her shoulder. This verse is a part of the narrative in Genesis chapter 24 that recounts the story of how Isaac, the son of Abraham, found a wife. In this chapter, Abraham sends his servant to his homeland to find a wife for Isaac from among his relatives, rather than from the Canaanites among whom they were living. The servant's journey led him to the city of Nahor, and he stopped at a well where women would come to draw water. In Genesis chapter 24 verse 15, the scene unfolds as the servant is still praying to God, seeking guidance in finding a suitable wife for Isaac. Before he had finished speaking, Rebekah, who was the granddaughter of Nahor and the daughter of Bethuel, came out to the well with her pitcher on her shoulder. The timing was significant, as it demonstrated God's providential intervention in answering the servant's prayer even before he had finished speaking. The mention of Rebekah carrying a pitcher upon her shoulder is a detail that emphasizes her readiness and willingness to serve and provide water. It also highlights her industriousness and strength, as carrying a pitcher of water on one's shoulder was a physically demanding task. This verse underscores the importance of prayer and God's providence in guiding our lives. The servant's prayer was answered swiftly and directly, demonstrating God's involvement in the affairs of humankind. It also serves as an example of God's faithfulness in fulfilling His promises to Abraham, ensuring that Isaac would have a suitable wife from his own kin. Overall, Genesis chapter 24 verse 15 showcases the theme of divine guidance and intervention in the lives of individuals who seek God's will and direction. It reminds us to trust in God's timing and providence as we navigate through life and seek His guidance in our decisions and endeavors. Genesis chapter 24 verse 16. And the damsel was very fair to look upon, a virgin, neither had any man known her. And she went down to the well, and filled her pitcher, and came up. This verse is part of the narrative of Abraham's servant seeking a wife for Isaac. Abraham had entrusted his servant with the important task of finding a suitable wife for his son from among his own relatives. In Genesis chapter 24, the servant sets out on this mission and arrives at a well in the city of Nahor. In verse 16, the focus is on a specific young woman whom the servant encounters at the well. The verse describes her as very fair to look upon, meaning she was physically attractive. It also emphasizes her virginity by stating that neither had any man known her, indicating that she had not been involved in any sexual relationships. It is important to note that the concept of physical attractiveness mentioned here is not the sole determining factor for choosing a spouse in the Bible. While physical appearance may catch our attention, the Bible consistently emphasizes the importance of character, faith, and virtue when considering a life partner. In the context of this narrative, the mention of the young woman's beauty and virginity serves to highlight her potential as a suitable wife for Isaac, who was also a person of significant importance in the biblical narrative. This passage emphasizes the cultural norms and expectations of the time, where virginity was highly valued, and it was desirable for the chosen wife to be a woman of good character and purity. The narrative in Genesis chapter 24 continues beyond this verse, as the servant engages in conversation with the young woman and discovers that she is indeed from Abraham's family. The story unfolds with the servant seeking confirmation from God that she is the chosen one for Isaac. Ultimately, the servant returns with the young woman, Rebekah, who becomes Isaac's wife. This verse can serve as a reminder for believers to seek godly qualities when considering a life partner. While physical appearance may be a factor, the Bible encourages us to prioritize character, integrity, and shared faith as essential qualities in a spouse. Additionally, this passage also highlights the faithfulness of God in guiding the servant to find a suitable wife for Isaac, demonstrating his involvement in the details of our lives when we seek his guidance. In conclusion, Genesis chapter 24 verse 16 provides a glimpse into the narrative of the servant seeking a wife for Isaac, emphasizing the physical beauty and virginity of the young woman he encounters. While these attributes were culturally significant at the time, the overall message of the Bible encourages us to prioritize godly character and faith when seeking a life partner. Genesis chapter 24 verse 17. And the servant ran to meet her, and said, Let me, I pray thee, drink a little water of thy pitcher. This verse is part of the narrative in Genesis that recounts the story of Abraham's servant who was sent to find a wife for Isaac, Abraham's son. The servant had arrived at a well in Nahor, and he prayed to God, asking for a sign to guide him in choosing the right woman for Isaac. In response to his prayer, Rebekah, the granddaughter of Abraham's brother Nahor, came to the well. In Genesis chapter 24 verse 17, we see the servant's immediate reaction upon seeing Rebekah. He runs to meet her and requests a drink of water from her pitcher. This verse reveals the servant's proactive and determined attitude in carrying out his mission. Let's explore a few key themes and lessons we can draw from this verse. Obedience and faithfulness. Abraham's servant exemplifies obedience and faithfulness by diligently following his master's instructions. His willingness to carry out this important task reflects his trust in Abraham and his faith in God's guidance. This reminds us of the importance of being obedient and faithful to God's commands and instructions. Initiative and diligence. The servant's immediate action of running towards Rebekah demonstrates his initiative and diligence. He doesn't hesitate or waste time. Instead, he takes quick steps to fulfill his responsibility. This shows us the importance of being proactive and diligent in our own lives, especially when it comes to fulfilling God's purposes. Hospitality and kindness. The servant's request for water reveals his courteous and hospitable nature. He approaches Rebekah with respect and humility, seeking a simple act of kindness. This teaches us the value of extending hospitality and showing kindness to others, even in small gestures. It reminds us that acts of kindness can have a significant impact on people's lives. Divine providence. The meeting between the servant and Rebekah at the well illustrates God's providential guidance and intervention. The servant's prayer for a sign was answered through the arrival of Rebekah, who displayed the qualities he sought. This highlights God's involvement in every aspect of our lives, including our relationships and decision-making processes. Overall, Genesis chapter 24 verse 17 portrays the servant's obedience, initiative, hospitality, and trust in God's guidance. As we reflect on this verse, we are encouraged to exhibit similar qualities in our own lives, embracing obedience, initiative, hospitality, and trust in God's providence. Genesis chapter 24 verse 18. And she said, Drink, my lord. And she hasted, and let down her pitcher upon her hand, and gave him drink. This verse is part of the narrative in Genesis chapter 24, where Abraham sends his servant to find a wife for his son Isaac. The servant arrives at a well in Nahor and prays to God for a sign to guide him in choosing the right woman. As he finishes his prayer, Rebekah, the daughter of Bethuel, comes to the well with her pitcher. In this particular verse, Rebekah offers the servant a drink when she sees him. Her response is not only hospitable but also an act of kindness and generosity towards a stranger. Let's explore some key points and themes that we can draw from this verse. Hospitality. Hospitality is a prevalent theme in the Bible, particularly in the Old Testament. Rebekah's willingness to offer a drink to the stranger demonstrates her hospitality and kindness. This act of hospitality reflects the cultural values of the time and reveals Rebekah's character as someone who is caring and considerate. Servanthood. The servant sent by Abraham was on a mission to find a suitable wife for Isaac. In this verse, Rebekah's act of serving the servant by giving him a drink is significant. It highlights the concept of servanthood and humility. Rebekah's willingness to serve the stranger demonstrates her humility and willingness to help others. It also foreshadows her future role as a servant and wife to Isaac. Divine guidance. Prior to this encounter, the servant had prayed to God for guidance. The timing of Rebekah's arrival and her willingness to provide water to the servant can be seen as an answer to his prayer. It highlights the providence and guidance of God in fulfilling his purposes. This story shows how God works behind the scenes to orchestrate events and bring about his plans. Faithfulness. This verse also reveals the faithfulness of Rebekah in carrying out her duties. She promptly hasted to offer the servant a drink, indicating her commitment to fulfilling her responsibilities. Her actions demonstrate her faithfulness not only to her family, but also to the stranger who arrives at the well. Overall, Genesis chapter 24 verse 18 teaches us important lessons about hospitality, servanthood, divine guidance, and faithfulness. Rebekah's act of kindness and her willingness to serve the servant reflect virtues that are highly valued in the biblical narrative. As we study this verse, we can reflect on how we can emulate these qualities in our own lives and relationships with others. Genesis chapter 24 verse 19. And when she had done giving him drink, she said, I will draw water for thy camels also, until they have done drinking. Genesis chapter 24 verse 19 is part of the narrative of Abraham's servant, who was sent by Abraham to find a wife for his son Isaac. In this particular verse, the servant arrives at a well in the city of Nahor and encounters Rebekah, a young woman who demonstrates hospitality and kindness towards him and his camels. The context of this verse is essential for understanding its significance. Abraham's servant had been entrusted with the task of finding a suitable wife for Isaac, but he was uncertain about how to identify the right woman. He prayed to God, asking for a sign to guide him in his search. His prayer included a request that the woman who offered him and his camels water would be the chosen one. When Rebekah arrives at the well and provides water to the servant, she not only fulfills his prayer but goes beyond his expectations. After giving the servant a drink, she voluntarily offers to draw water for his camels as well. This act of going above and beyond what was asked of her demonstrates her generosity, compassion, and servant-heartedness. Rebekah's actions in Genesis chapter 24 verse 19 reveal several admirable qualities. First, her willingness to serve shows her humility and selflessness. Drawing water for the camels was a laborious task, as camels can drink large quantities of water. Yet, Rebekah willingly undertakes this task without hesitation. Second, Rebekah's actions display her hospitality. In the ancient Near East, offering water to travelers was a customary act of kindness and a sign of hospitality. By offering water to the servant and his camels, Rebekah exemplifies the cultural value of hospitality, showing care and concern for strangers. Finally, Rebekah's act of drawing water for the camels exhibits her industriousness and hard work. It was no small feat to draw water for numerous thirsty camels, but Rebekah does so diligently, highlighting her strong work ethic. This passage not only portrays Rebekah as a woman of noble character, but also highlights God's providence and faithfulness in answering the servant's prayer. God orchestrates circumstances to guide the servant to Rebekah, who exemplifies the qualities he was seeking in a wife for Isaac. Overall, Genesis chapter 24 verse 19 teaches us important lessons about kindness, hospitality, humility, and diligence. Rebekah's actions serve as an inspiration for believers to demonstrate these qualities in our own lives and to trust in God's guidance as we seek to honor Him in our relationships and interactions with others. Genesis chapter 24 verse 20. And she hasted, and emptied her pitcher into the trough, and ran again unto the well to draw water, and drew for all his camels. Context: Genesis chapter 24 records the account of Abraham's servant seeking a wife for Isaac. The servant had been sent to Abraham's homeland to find a wife from among his relatives. In this verse, the servant encounters Rebekah, who demonstrates hospitality and a servant's heart by offering to draw water for both him and his camels. Diligence and hospitality. Rebekah's actions in this verse reflect her character of diligence and hospitality. She hastened to fulfill the task of drawing water, showing her willingness to serve others. Moreover, the act of drawing water for the servant's camels required significant effort, as camels drink large amounts of water. Rebekah's generosity and willingness to go the extra mile to serve the servant and his camels demonstrate her kind and caring nature. Biblical principles. This verse teaches us several biblical principles. First, it emphasizes the value of diligence in serving others. Rebekah did not delay or hesitate but acted promptly to fulfill her task. In our own lives, we can learn from her example by being diligent and prompt in our service to others. Servanthood and kindness. Rebekah's actions also highlight the importance of servanthood and kindness. She willingly took on the task of drawing water, demonstrating a servant's heart and a willingness to go above and beyond in helping others. This aligns with Jesus' teaching in the New Testament, where he emphasized the importance of serving others with humility and kindness. Faith and God's providence. The entire account of Abraham's servant seeking a wife for Isaac reflects God's providential guidance. In this verse, Rebekah's actions were not merely coincidental but orchestrated by God to fulfill His plan. It highlights God's faithfulness in directing events and fulfilling His promises. It also serves as a reminder that God works through the actions of faithful individuals to accomplish His purposes. Application. From this verse, we can learn to cultivate a servant's heart, being willing to serve others diligently and going the extra mile to meet their needs. Rebekah's example also encourages us to practice kindness and hospitality, as these virtues reflect Christ's love in our lives. Additionally, it reminds us to trust in God's providential guidance and rely on His faithfulness as we navigate through life. Remember to study the context of Genesis chapter 24 and explore the entire chapter to gain a deeper understanding of the story and its significance. Genesis chapter 24 verse 21. And the man wondering at her held his peace, to wit whether the Lord had made his journey prosperous or not. This verse is part of the narrative in Genesis chapter 24, where Abraham sends his servant to find a wife for his son Isaac. The servant arrives at the city of Nahor and encounters Rebekah, who shows great hospitality and kindness to him and his camels. The verse in question describes the servant's reaction to this encounter. To understand the significance of this verse, let's examine the context and the themes it highlights. God's providence. The servant's response reflects his recognition of God's providential guidance. He pauses and ponders whether the Lord had made his journey successful. It demonstrates the servant's trust in God's involvement and guidance throughout the entire process. He recognizes that the outcome of his mission is not solely dependent on his efforts but on God's intervention as well. Divine guidance. This verse emphasizes the belief in divine guidance and intervention. The servant's wonder and silence indicate his acknowledgement that God is orchestrating events behind the scenes. It reveals a deep faith in God's sovereignty and the belief that God can work in mysterious ways to accomplish His purposes. Trusting in God's will. The servant's silence signifies his patience and willingness to wait for God's confirmation or sign before taking further action. Instead of rushing ahead or assuming the outcome, he allows God's will to unfold and waits for divine confirmation. This attitude exemplifies trust and reliance on God's wisdom and timing, rather than solely relying on human judgment or intuition. Discernment and evaluation. The servant's hesitation shows his discernment and desire to evaluate the situation carefully. He wonders whether this encounter aligns with the specific guidance he had sought from God. This highlights the importance of discernment in our own lives. It encourages us to pause, evaluate, and seek confirmation from God when faced with significant decisions or encounters. Overall, Genesis chapter 24 verse 21 teaches us the importance of recognizing God's providence, relying on divine guidance, and patiently waiting for God's confirmation in our lives. It encourages us to trust in God's will and seek His discernment when making important decisions. Genesis chapter 24 verse 22. And it came to pass, as the camels had done drinking, that the man took a golden earring of 1/2 shekel weight, and 2 bracelets for her hands of 10 shekels weight of gold. This verse is part of the narrative in Genesis chapter 24, which recounts the story of how Abraham's servant sought a wife for Isaac. In this particular verse, the servant has arrived at a well and encountered Rebekah, who showed him kindness by offering water for him and his camels. Let's explore the significance and themes present in this verse and its surrounding context. Faithfulness to God's promises. Genesis chapter 24 demonstrates the faithfulness of Abraham to God's promises concerning his descendants. Abraham was concerned that his son Isaac should have a wife from among his own people rather than from the Canaanites. Thus, he sent his trusted servant to find a suitable wife from his homeland. Divine guidance. The servant's journey to find a wife for Isaac is marked by divine guidance and providence. In the previous verses, the servant had prayed for a specific sign from God to identify the chosen woman. Rebekah's kindness and willingness to offer water to the servant and his camels aligned with the sign the servant had requested, indicating that God had directed him to the right person. Generosity and hospitality. Rebekah's act of offering water not only to the servant but also to his camels showcases her generosity and hospitality. This act of kindness sets her apart and demonstrates her character, making her a suitable candidate to become Isaac's wife. It also reflects the cultural value of hospitality and the importance of treating strangers with kindness and respect. Symbolism of gold jewelry. In verse 22, the servant presents Rebekah with a golden earring and 2 bracelets made of gold. These gifts symbolize the servant's gratitude and appreciation for her hospitality. Additionally, they serve as tokens of honor and affirmation of Rebekah's worthiness to be Isaac's bride. Gold was highly valued and often associated with wealth, status, and beauty in biblical times. Overall, Genesis chapter 24 verse 22 highlights themes of faithfulness to God's promises, divine guidance, acts of kindness and hospitality, and the significance of symbolism in ancient Near Eastern culture. It further emphasizes the importance of character and discernment in choosing a suitable partner. Genesis chapter 24 verse 23, and said, Whose daughter art thou? Tell me, I pray thee, is there room in thy father's house for us to lodge in? Genesis chapter 24 verse 23 is part of the narrative that describes Abraham's servant's journey to find a wife for Isaac, Abraham's son. In this verse, the servant has reached his destination and encounters Rebekah, who will ultimately become Isaac's wife. Background. The context of Genesis chapter 24 is that Abraham was getting old, and he wanted to ensure that his son Isaac would have a suitable wife from his own people rather than from the Canaanites among whom they dwelt. Abraham entrusted this important task to his chief servant, who took an oath to fulfill it faithfully. The servant's question. In Genesis chapter 24 verse 23, the servant asks Rebekah about her lineage and the availability of lodging in her father's house. This question served 2 purposes. Firstly, the servant wanted to ascertain Rebekah's family background to ensure she came from Abraham's kindred. Secondly, he wanted to confirm if there was sufficient room for himself, his companions, and their camels to lodge at her father's house. Importance of family lineage. The servant's question about Rebekah's lineage reflects the cultural significance of family connections and ancestry during that time. In ancient Hebrew society, It was crucial to marry within one's own clan or tribe to preserve family identity and honor. By ensuring that Rebekah came from Abraham's family, the servant sought to fulfill his master's wishes and maintain the integrity of the covenant God had made with Abraham. Hospitality and generosity. The servant's inquiry about lodging demonstrates the importance of hospitality in the biblical culture. It was customary to offer food, shelter, and provisions to travelers, particularly in the desert regions where hospitality could mean the difference between life and death. The servant wanted to confirm that Rebekah's family would extend this customary kindness to him and his company. Symbolism and foreshadowing. This verse also holds symbolic significance within the larger biblical narrative. The servant's question foreshadows the concept of the church as the bride of Christ. In the New Testament, the church is often depicted as the bride of Christ, and Christ himself is described as the bridegroom. Just as the servant sought a suitable bride for Isaac, Jesus, as the ultimate bridegroom, seeks a faithful and pure church. This symbolism emphasizes the importance of being part of God's family and dwelling in His house. In summary, Genesis chapter 24 verse 23 portrays the servant's diligent search for a suitable wife for Isaac. It highlights the significance of family lineage and hospitality in biblical culture, while also holding symbolic foreshadowing of the relationship between Christ and the church. Genesis chapter 24 verse 24. And she said unto him, I am the daughter of Bethuel the son of Milcah, which she bare unto Nahor. Context: Genesis chapter 24 tells the story of how Abraham sent his servant to find a wife for his son Isaac from among his relatives in Mesopotamia. The servant traveled to the city of Nahor and prayed for a sign from God to confirm the right woman. At the well, he encounters Rebekah, and in verse 24, Rebekah identifies herself to the servant. Understanding the characters. Abraham, the patriarch and father of Isaac, who sends his servant to find a wife for Isaac. Isaac, the son of Abraham, for whom a wife is sought. Abraham's servant, the unnamed servant who is tasked with finding a wife for Isaac. Rebekah, the daughter of Bethuel, grandniece of Abraham, and the woman chosen to be Isaac's wife. Identity and lineage. In Genesis chapter 24 verse 24, Rebekah reveals her identity to the servant. She states that she is the daughter of Bethuel, who is the son of Milcah. This information establishes Rebekah's lineage and helps the servant confirm that she is indeed from the right family for Isaac. Cultural significance. In ancient times, knowing one's lineage was highly significant. It helped establish a person's family background, reputation, and position within society. Rebekah's affirmation of her lineage was crucial for the servant as he sought to fulfill his mission of finding a suitable wife for Isaac. God's guidance. Throughout this narrative, we see God's providence and guidance at work. Abraham entrusted the task of finding a wife for Isaac to his servant, who sought divine guidance through prayer. Rebekah's appearance and her confirmation of her lineage were seen as clear signs from God, affirming that she was the chosen woman for Isaac. Foreshadowing. This verse also sets the stage for future events in the book of Genesis. Rebekah's lineage is mentioned here, connecting her to Abraham's family. This connection becomes significant in later narratives, including the birth of Jacob and Esau, where Rebekah plays a prominent role. Application. Faith in God's guidance. Like Abraham's servant, we should seek God's guidance and trust in His providence as we make decisions in our lives. The importance of character and lineage. Rebekah's affirmation of her identity highlights the significance of maintaining good character and being aware of our family heritage. Recognizing God's signs. Rebekah's appearance and confirmation of her lineage were seen as divine signs. We should be attentive to the ways God may be guiding us and be open to His leading in our lives. Remember to read the surrounding verses and chapters to gain a deeper understanding of the context and the overall message conveyed in Genesis chapter 24. Genesis chapter 24 verse 25. She said moreover unto him, We have both straw and provender enough, and room to lodge in. Genesis chapter 24 verse 25 is part of the narrative in which Abraham sends his servant to find a wife for his son Isaac. The servant has arrived at the city of Nahor and is seeking guidance from God to identify the woman who would be suitable as Isaac's wife. In this particular verse, the servant encounters Rebekah, who displays a generous and hospitable spirit. When the servant requests water for himself, she not only provides him with water but also offers to water his camels as well. Impressed by her kindness and generosity, the servant gives her various gifts, including jewelry. Rebekah's response in verse 25 highlights her willingness to accommodate the servant and his camels. She tells him that they have an ample supply of straw and provender, food for the animals, and enough room for him to lodge in. This gracious response demonstrates Rebekah's hospitality and willingness to go the extra mile to assist the stranger. From a broader perspective, this verse offers several lessons that can be gleaned from Rebekah's actions: generosity and hospitality. Rebekah's willingness to provide water not only for the servant but also for his camels showcases her generous and hospitable nature. It reminds us of the importance of being open-hearted and welcoming to others, even strangers who may be in need. Going above and beyond, Rebekah's offer to water the camels goes beyond the servant's initial request. Her willingness to do more than what is asked of her exemplifies the concept of going the extra mile and doing acts of kindness that surpass expectations. Faithfulness in small things. Rebekah's willingness to help with seemingly mundane tasks like watering the camels reveals her faithfulness in small responsibilities. It reminds us that even in seemingly insignificant actions, we can demonstrate our faithfulness and integrity. God's provision. Rebekah's words about having enough straw, provender, and room to lodge in indicate that God has blessed her household with abundance. This serves as a reminder that God is the ultimate provider, and when we extend hospitality and generosity, we can trust in His provision. Overall, Genesis chapter 24 verse 25 presents Rebekah as a shining example of hospitality and generosity. Her actions remind us of the importance of showing kindness to others, going beyond what is expected, and trusting in God's provision in our lives. Genesis chapter 24 verse 26. And the man bowed down his head, and worshipped the Lord. Genesis chapter 24 verse 26 is part of the narrative in which Abraham's servant is sent to find a wife for Isaac, Abraham's son. In this particular verse, the servant has just witnessed God's providence in leading him to Rebekah, who demonstrates qualities of kindness and generosity. Let's explore the significance of this verse in the broader context of the story and its spiritual lessons. Worship and reverence for God. The verse begins with the servant bowing down his head and worshipping the Lord. This action illustrates an attitude of reverence and acknowledges God's involvement in the events that have unfolded. It highlights the servant's deep faith and gratitude to God for guiding him to the right woman to fulfill the task entrusted to him. It reminds us of the importance of worshipping and honoring God in our lives, acknowledging His sovereignty and involvement in our circumstances. Acknowledging God's guidance, the servant's act of worship is a response to recognizing God's hand at work in his journey. From the moment the servant set out, he had prayed for a sign, asking God to reveal the woman who would be the right match for Isaac. Through a series of events, God orchestrated the meeting with Rebekah, fulfilling the servant's prayer. This verse demonstrates the servant's acknowledgement of God's guidance, affirming the principle that when we seek God's direction and trust in Him, He can guide our steps and bring about His will. Trust in God's faithfulness. The servant's worship in this verse is a testament to his trust in God's faithfulness. He recognizes that God has been faithful in answering his prayer and providing the right woman. This act of worship is an expression of confidence in God's character and His ability to fulfill His promises. It serves as a reminder for us to trust in God's faithfulness in our own lives, even when facing uncertainty or difficult situations. Gratitude for God's blessings. The servant's worship is also an expression of gratitude for the blessings he has received. He is thankful for God's guidance and provision in leading him to Rebekah. It teaches us the importance of cultivating a heart of gratitude and offering thanks to God for His blessings, both big and small, recognizing that every good gift comes from Him. In summary, Genesis chapter 24 verse 26 captures the servant's act of worship and his acknowledgement of God's guidance and faithfulness in leading him to Rebekah. It emphasizes the importance of worshiping and reverencing God, trusting in His faithfulness, and expressing gratitude for His blessings in our lives. These principles can be applied to our own faith journeys as we seek God's guidance, trust in His providence, and offer Him our heartfelt worship and gratitude. Genesis chapter 24 verse 27. And he said, Blessed be the Lord God of my master Abraham, who hath not left destitute my master of his mercy and his truth. I being in the way, the Lord led me to the house of my master's brethren. Context: Genesis chapter 24 recounts the story of Abraham's servant, who was sent to find a wife for Isaac from Abraham's relatives in Mesopotamia. In this verse, the servant acknowledges God's guidance and expresses gratitude for His provision. Acknowledging God's blessing, the servant begins by acknowledging and blessing the Lord God of his master Abraham. He recognizes that the Lord deserves to be blessed and praised for His goodness and faithfulness. God's mercy and truth, the servant acknowledges that God had not left his master Abraham destitute of His mercy and truth. This phrase emphasizes the servant's understanding of God's character. God had shown His mercy by leading the servant to find a suitable wife for Isaac and had fulfilled His promise to bless Abraham's descendants. Trusting God's guidance, the servant acknowledges that he was in the right place, being in the way, because the Lord led him to the house of Abraham's relatives. This statement reflects the servant's confidence in God's guidance and providence. It highlights the servant's faith in God's ability to lead him to the right person who would fulfill his master's request. Application of the verse: Genesis chapter 24 verse 27 teaches us several important lessons. Gratitude and acknowledgement. Like the servant, we should express gratitude and acknowledge God's blessings in our lives. Recognizing and praising God for His mercy, faithfulness, and provision fosters a spirit of thanksgiving and deepens our relationship with Him. Trusting God's guidance. The servant's trust in God's guidance is an example for us. We should trust in God's leading and be confident that He will direct our steps as we seek to obey Him. When we rely on God's guidance, He can lead us to the right people, places, and opportunities. Faith in God's character. The servant's acknowledgement of God's mercy and truth reflects his understanding of God's character. We, too, can trust in God's unchanging nature. His mercy, faithfulness, and truthfulness endure forever, and we can rely on Him in all circumstances. In summary, Genesis chapter 24 verse 27 highlights the servant's gratitude, trust in God's guidance, and acknowledgement of God's character. It encourages us to express thanksgiving, trust in God's leading, and have faith in His unchanging nature. Genesis chapter 24 verse 28. And the damsel ran, and told them of her mother's house these things. Context: Genesis chapter 24 records the account of Abraham's servant being sent to find a wife for Isaac, Abraham's son. The servant arrived at the city of Nahor and prayed for a sign from God to identify the woman who would be the suitable bride for Isaac. Rebekah, the granddaughter of Abraham's brother Nahor, fulfilled the sign by offering water to the servant and his camels. After this, the servant gave her gifts of jewelry, and she hurried to her mother's house to share the news. Here are some key points and lessons we can derive from Genesis chapter 24 verse 28. Obedience and faithfulness. Rebekah demonstrated obedience and faithfulness by promptly running to her mother's house to share the news. She recognized the importance of her encounter with the servant and understood the significance of the gifts she received. Her willingness to act immediately shows her trust in God's leading. Gratitude and humility. The fact that Rebekah shared the news with her mother's household reveals her gratitude and humility. Instead of boasting or keeping the information to herself, she acknowledged the role her family would play in this important decision and involved them from the beginning. Respect for parental guidance. Rebekah's decision to inform her mother's household indicates her respect for her family and their involvement in the decision-making process. In ancient Near Eastern culture, parental consent was highly valued, especially in marriage arrangements. Rebekah's actions demonstrate her understanding of this cultural norm and her willingness to honor her family's guidance. Communication and community. Rebekah's actions highlight the importance of communication within a community. By sharing the news with her mother's household, she involved them in the process and sought their input. This emphasizes the significance of seeking wisdom and counsel from trusted individuals when making important decisions. God's providence. Rebekah's encounter with Abraham's servant and her subsequent actions reveal God's providential guidance. God had orchestrated events to lead the servant to Rebekah, and her immediate response demonstrated that she was the chosen woman for Isaac. This passage reminds us of God's faithfulness in directing our paths and aligning circumstances for His purposes. Overall, Genesis chapter 24 verse 28 teaches us about obedience, faithfulness, gratitude, humility, respect for parental guidance, the importance of communication and community, and God's providential leading. It encourages us to trust in God's guidance in our own lives and involve those around us in important decision-making processes. Genesis chapter 24 verse 29. And Rebekah had a brother, and his name was Laban, and Laban ran out unto the man, unto the well. This verse is part of the larger narrative of the search for a wife for Isaac. In Genesis chapter 24, Abraham, who was advanced in age, sends his servant to find a suitable wife for his son Isaac from among his relatives in Mesopotamia. The servant embarked on this mission and arrived at the city of Nahor, where he encountered Rebekah, who would eventually become Isaac's wife. In verse 29, we are introduced to Rebekah's brother, Laban. Upon seeing the servant and recognizing that he was a stranger, Laban hurriedly ran out to meet him at the well. This act of running out to greet the servant demonstrates Laban's hospitality and curiosity, as well as his desire to show kindness to a stranger. The significance of this verse lies in Laban's role in the story that follows. Laban plays a crucial part in the servant's mission, as he becomes involved in negotiating Rebekah's betrothal to Isaac. Laban's actions and interactions with the servant reveal aspects of his character and provide insights into the culture and customs of the time. Laban's running out to meet the servant can be seen as a positive gesture, illustrating his willingness to extend hospitality and assist strangers. This action also highlights the providential nature of the servant's journey, as Laban's encounter sets in motion the events that lead to Rebekah becoming Isaac's wife. As we continue reading the subsequent verses in Genesis chapter 24, we witness Laban's involvement in the negotiations between the servant and Rebekah's family. While Laban initially seems helpful, his character is later portrayed as somewhat cunning and opportunistic. Nevertheless, Laban's role in the story serves to demonstrate God's faithfulness in orchestrating events to fulfill His promises to Abraham and Isaac. In conclusion, Genesis chapter 24 verse 29 marks the introduction of Laban, Rebekah's brother, who plays a significant role in the narrative of finding a wife for Isaac. Laban's act of running out to meet the servant at the well showcases his hospitality and initiates a chain of events that lead to Rebekah's betrothal to Isaac. This verse reminds us of God's providential guidance in fulfilling His plans and demonstrates the importance of hospitality and kindness towards strangers. Genesis chapter 24 verse 30. And it came to pass, when he saw the earring and bracelets upon his sister's hands, and when he heard the words of Rebekah his sister, saying, Thus spake the man unto me, that he came unto the man, and, behold, he stood by the camels at the well. This verse is part of the narrative of Abraham's servant who was sent on a mission to find a wife for Isaac, Abraham's son. The servant had arrived at the city of Nahor and was seeking a sign from God to indicate the right woman for Isaac. As he approached the city, he saw a group of women gathering water at a well. Genesis chapter 24 verse 30 describes the servant's response upon seeing Rebekah, who would eventually become Isaac's wife. Context: The narrative begins in Genesis chapter 24, where Abraham instructs his servant to find a wife for Isaac from his own people rather than from the Canaanites. The servant took an oath to carry out his master's wishes faithfully. He traveled to the city of Nahor, where Abraham's relatives resided, to find a suitable bride for Isaac. The servant's encounter with Rebekah. As the servant approached the city, he saw Rebekah at the well. He noticed her wearing jewelry, including an earring and bracelets. Moreover, Rebekah's words, which relayed the servant's message, confirmed to the servant that God had led him to the right woman. The servant then went towards Rebekah and stood by the camels at the well. Importance of the earring and bracelets. The mention of the earring and bracelets serves as a confirmation of the servant's prayer for a specific sign. Prior to the servant's encounter with Rebekah, he had prayed, asking God to show him the right woman by having her offer him a drink of water and responding positively when he asked for water for his camels. The jewelry adorning Rebekah's hands likely caught the servant's attention and may have been one of the signs he had requested in his prayer. God's guidance and faithfulness. This verse highlights God's faithfulness to the servant's request and his guidance in leading him to Rebekah. God's providence is evident in the servant's encounter with Rebekah, as he sees the desired signs and hears the words confirming the servant's mission. It demonstrates that God was actively involved in the process of finding a suitable wife for Isaac, ensuring the continuation of the covenant made with Abraham. Overall, Genesis chapter 24 verse 30 illustrates the servant's recognition of the signs God had provided, which led him to Rebekah. It highlights the faithfulness of God in answering prayers and guiding his people. The story serves as a reminder of the importance of seeking God's guidance and relying on His faithfulness in our own lives. Genesis chapter 24 verse 31. And he said, Come in, thou blessed of the Lord. Wherefore standest thou without? For I have prepared the house, and room for the camels. In this verse, we find a significant event in the narrative of Abraham's servant who was sent to find a wife for Isaac. Let's explore the context and key themes of this passage. Background and context. Genesis chapter 24 tells the story of Abraham's servant, who was entrusted with the task of finding a suitable wife for Isaac. Abraham made the servant swear to find a wife from among his kindred and not from the Canaanites. The servant traveled to Abraham's homeland, near Nahor, and arrived at a well outside the city of Nahor. Recognition of divine blessing. When the servant arrives at the well, he prays to God, asking for a sign to identify the woman who would be Isaac's wife. He requests that the woman who offers water to him and his camels and shows kindness would be the chosen one. Genesis chapter 24 verses 12 through 14. Rebekah, the daughter of Abraham's nephew Bethuel, fulfills the servant's request and offers water not only to him but also to his camels. This act of generosity and kindness from Rebekah is a sign of God's blessing. Welcoming the blessed of the Lord. When the servant sees Rebekah's act of kindness and discerns that she is the chosen one, he responds by inviting her to her family's house. In Genesis chapter 24 verse 31, Laban, Rebekah's brother, welcomes the servant, acknowledging him as blessed by the Lord. This recognition is significant because it demonstrates the servant's connection to Abraham and the divine purpose behind his mission. Hospitality and preparation. Laban's words, "For I have prepared the house, and room for the camels," highlight the cultural value of hospitality and the willingness to accommodate guests. Laban's preparedness reflects the respect and honor he extends toward the servant. It also indicates the providential guidance of God, who orchestrates the events leading to Rebekah's betrothal to Isaac. Themes. Divine guidance. This passage illustrates God's hand in orchestrating events to fulfill His promises. From guiding the servant to Rebekah at the well to the preparedness of Laban, God's providence is evident throughout the narrative. Faithfulness and blessing. The faithfulness of Abraham and his servant in following God's instructions is rewarded with God's blessing. Isaac's future wife, Rebekah, is chosen through divine intervention and is seen as a blessing from the Lord. Hospitality and kindness. Laban's hospitality and willingness to accommodate the servant and his camels demonstrate the importance of showing kindness and generosity to others. This act of hospitality not only fulfills the cultural expectation but also aligns with God's purpose and plan. Overall, Genesis chapter 24 verse 31 showcases God's guidance, the faithfulness of his followers, and the importance of hospitality. It highlights the recognition of God's blessings and the role they play in the fulfillment of his promises. Genesis chapter 24 verse 32, "And the man came into the house, and he ungirded his camels, and gave straw and provender for the camels, and water to wash his feet, and the men's feet that were with him." Genesis chapter 24 verse 32 is part of the narrative of Abraham's servant, who was sent by Abraham to find a wife for his son Isaac. In this verse, the servant has arrived at the house of Rebekah's family, and it describes his actions upon entering the house. Hospitality and kindness. The servant demonstrates hospitality and kindness by taking care of his camels, providing them with straw and provender, food, ensuring their needs are met. This act reveals the servant's conscientiousness and his commitment to fulfilling his task diligently. Foot washing. The act of washing feet was a customary practice in ancient times, particularly when a guest arrived at someone's home. It was a way to refresh and cleanse one's feet after a long journey, usually performed by a servant or a host. In this verse, the servant not only washes his feet but also washes the feet of the men who accompanied him. This act signifies humility, servanthood, and respect for others. Cultural significance. In the context of the biblical culture, these acts of hospitality and foot washing reflect the importance placed on caring for guests and travelers. It demonstrates a sense of honor and respect for the stranger, acknowledging their weary journey and providing comfort. Symbolism. Symbolically, this passage can also be seen as a foreshadowing of Jesus' teachings on servanthood and humility. In the New Testament, Jesus washed the feet of his disciples to exemplify the importance of serving others. John chapter 13 verses 1 through 17. The servant's actions in Genesis chapter 24 verse 32 foreshadow this act of humble service. Faithfulness to Abraham. This verse also highlights the servant's faithfulness to his master, Abraham. He has traveled a great distance and is now fulfilling his mission to find a wife for Isaac. By caring for his camels and washing his feet, he demonstrates his commitment to carrying out his master's wishes. Overall, Genesis chapter 24 verse 32 presents a picture of hospitality, kindness, humility, and faithful service. It reminds us of the importance of welcoming and caring for others, even as we see the servant's dedication to fulfilling his assigned task. Genesis chapter 24 verse 33. "And there was set meat before him to eat, but he said, I will not eat, until I have told mine errand. And he said, Speak on." This verse is part of the narrative where Abraham's servant, who was tasked with finding a wife for Isaac, arrives at the house of Laban, the brother of Rebekah. Let's explore the key themes and insights from this passage. Faithfulness and dedication. The servant of Abraham demonstrates his unwavering commitment to fulfilling his mission. Despite being offered food, he refuses to eat until he has communicated his errand. This reveals his dedication and loyalty to Abraham and the importance he places on carrying out his duty faithfully. In our own lives, this passage encourages us to be faithful and diligent in fulfilling the tasks and responsibilities entrusted to us. Prioritizing God's work. The servant's refusal to eat until he has relayed his message highlights his priority of carrying out God's work. Rather than indulging in immediate gratification, he focuses on the mission at hand. This teaches us the value of prioritizing God's kingdom and assignments above our personal desires and comforts. Effective communication. When Laban invites the servant to share his errand, the servant seizes the opportunity to communicate the purpose of his visit. This demonstrates the servant's clarity in conveying his message. It also emphasizes the importance of effective communication when sharing God's word or explaining our intentions. We should strive to articulate our beliefs and missions clearly, just as the servant did. patience and perseverance. The servant's determination to complete his task is evident in his decision to delay his meal. His patience and perseverance reflect qualities necessary in carrying out God's work. Similarly, we are encouraged to exercise patience and remain steadfast when faced with obstacles or delays in fulfilling the tasks God has assigned to us. Respect and courtesy. The passage also illustrates the hospitality and respect shown by Laban towards the servant. Laban provided a meal for the servant, acknowledging his weary state and the significance of his visit. This demonstrates the importance of showing respect and extending hospitality to those who are on God's mission. It reminds us to treat messengers of God with honor and consideration. Overall, Genesis chapter 24 verse 33 presents valuable lessons about faithfulness, dedication, prioritizing God's work, effective communication, patience, perseverance, and demonstrating respect and courtesy. By examining these themes, we can glean insights that are applicable to our own lives as we seek to serve God and fulfill our respective callings. Genesis chapter 24 verse 34. And he said, I am Abraham's servant. This verse is part of the narrative in Genesis chapter 24, where Abraham's servant is sent on a mission to find a wife for Isaac, Abraham's son. The servant has arrived in the city of Nahor and is recounting the purpose of his journey to the family of Rebekah, who would eventually become Isaac's wife. To understand the significance of this verse, it's important to consider the broader context of the passage. Abraham was a prominent figure in the Old Testament, chosen by God to be the father of a great nation, Genesis chapter 12 verse 1 through verse 3. He had received specific promises from God regarding his descendants, including the promise of a son through whom the blessings would come, Genesis chapter 15 verse 4 through verse 6. In Genesis chapter 24, Abraham, being advanced in age, was concerned about finding a suitable wife for Isaac, who would continue the lineage and fulfill the promises of God. As a result, he entrusted his servant with the task of finding a wife from among his relatives, rather than from the Canaanites among whom they were living. When the servant arrived in Nahor, he prayed to God, asking for a specific sign to identify the chosen woman. He requested that the woman who would offer to give him water and water his camels would be the one appointed by God to be Isaac's wife, Genesis chapter 24 verse 12 through verse 14. When Rebekah arrived at the well and fulfilled the servant's request, he recognized that she was the chosen woman. In verse 34, the servant responds to Rebekah's family by introducing himself, saying, I am Abraham's servant. This statement was a way for the servant to establish his credibility and assure Rebekah's family that his purpose was honorable and that he was acting on behalf of Abraham, a man of great importance and blessing. This verse highlights the faithfulness and obedience of Abraham's servant. Despite being entrusted with an important mission, he did not boast about himself or his abilities but acknowledged his role as a servant. By aligning himself with Abraham, he demonstrated that he was acting under the authority and guidance of his master. Furthermore, this verse points to the significance of Abraham's lineage and the importance of finding a wife for Isaac from within that lineage. Abraham's servant recognized that the woman he was seeking would be joining a family chosen by God for a specific purpose, and he wanted to emphasize that connection. In a broader spiritual sense, this verse also provides a reminder of the significance of serving God faithfully. Just as Abraham's servant identified himself as a servant of Abraham, Christians are called to be servants of God. It is a position of humility, obedience, and recognizing that we act under the authority and guidance of our Heavenly Father. By acknowledging our role as servants, we position ourselves to carry out God's will and participate in His plans and blessings. In summary, Genesis chapter 24 verse 34 highlights the role of Abraham's servant in finding a wife for Isaac and emphasizes the servant's humility and obedience. It also underscores the importance of recognizing our position as servants of God and acting under His authority and guidance. Genesis chapter 24 verse 35. And the Lord hath blessed my master greatly, and he is become great, and he hath given him flocks, and herds, and silver, and gold, and menservants, and maidservants, and camels, and asses. Genesis chapter 24 verse 35 is part of a larger passage that recounts the story of Abraham's servant's journey to find a wife for Isaac. In this verse, the servant is speaking to Laban, the brother of Rebekah, whom he believes God has led him to as a potential wife for Isaac. Let's break down the verse and explore its key themes and lessons. God's blessings. The verse begins by acknowledging the abundant blessings that the Lord had bestowed upon Abraham. It highlights how God had greatly blessed Abraham, causing him to become a great man. This emphasizes the concept of God's providence and his ability to bless his people abundantly. Material prosperity. The verse lists various material blessings that God had given to Abraham. These include flocks, herds, silver, gold, menservants, maidservants, camels, and donkeys. These possessions were indicators of wealth and prosperity during that time. It illustrates how God had blessed Abraham with material abundance, reflecting God's faithfulness and provision. Stewardship. The verse also highlights Abraham's role as a faithful steward of the blessings God had given him. Abraham had been entrusted with these possessions, and he managed them responsibly. This reminds us of the importance of stewardship and using the resources we receive from God in a way that pleases Him and benefits others. God's guidance. The context of this verse emphasizes the guidance and leading of God. The servant acknowledges that God had directed him to Rebekah as the chosen bride for Isaac. It demonstrates the servant's recognition of God's hand in his journey and his trust in God's guidance. This teaches us to seek God's direction and trust in His leading in our own lives. Overall, Genesis chapter 24 verse 35 serves as a reminder of God's blessings, provision, and guidance in the lives of His people. It encourages us to be faithful stewards of the resources we receive from God and to trust in His leading as we navigate through life. Genesis chapter 24 verse 36. And Sarah my master's wife bare a son to my master when she was old, and unto him hath he given all that he hath. This verse is part of the account where Abraham's servant is speaking to Laban, the brother of Rebekah, whom he has met at the well. The servant has been sent by Abraham to find a wife for his son Isaac. In this verse, the servant is recounting the story of how Sarah, Abraham's wife, gave birth to a son in her old age, and how Abraham has given everything he has to this son. This verse highlights several important themes and aspects of the biblical narrative. God's faithfulness. The birth of Isaac to Sarah in her old age was a miraculous event. It demonstrated God's faithfulness to fulfill His promise to Abraham that he would become the father of many nations, Genesis chapter 17 verse 16. Even when Sarah's womb was barren and her chances of conceiving seemed impossible, God intervened and enabled her to conceive. The significance of the promised son. Isaac was the son of promise, through whom God's covenant with Abraham would continue. Abraham had previously been promised that his descendants would be as numerous as the stars, Genesis chapter 15 verse 5. By giving Isaac everything he had, Abraham is affirming his belief in God's promise and his commitment to pass on the blessings of the covenant to his son. The lineage of Jesus. Isaac's birth is a crucial step in the fulfillment of God's plan for salvation. Isaac's descendants would eventually lead to the birth of Jesus Christ, who would be the ultimate fulfillment of God's promises and the Savior of humanity. This verse serves as a reminder of God's faithfulness and His ability to bring about miracles even in seemingly impossible situations. It also emphasizes the significance of the promised son, Isaac, in the unfolding of God's plan. As believers, we can find encouragement in knowing that God is faithful to His promises and that He can work through unlikely circumstances to accomplish His purposes. Genesis chapter 24 verse 37. And my master made me swear, saying, Thou shalt not take a wife to my son of the daughters of the Canaanites, in whose land I dwell. This verse is part of the narrative in Genesis where Abraham sends his servant to find a suitable wife for his son Isaac. In this particular verse, the servant is recounting the instructions he received from his master Abraham. Let's delve deeper into the context and significance of this verse. Context: Abraham, being advanced in age, desires to secure a wife for his son Isaac. He insists that Isaac's wife must not come from among the Canaanites, who were inhabitants of the land where Abraham and his family were dwelling. Instead, he desires a wife from his own country and kindred, as found in Genesis chapter 24 verses 3 and 4. Covenant promise. Abraham's directive is rooted in the covenant promise that God had made with him. God had promised Abraham that he would bless him, make him a great nation, and give him the land of Canaan as an inheritance, as found in Genesis chapter 12 verses 1, 2, and 3. To maintain the purity of the covenant line and ensure that Isaac's offspring would inherit the covenant blessings, Abraham wanted Isaac to marry within their own people. Spiritual significance. The prohibition against intermarrying with the Canaanites carries a spiritual significance as well. The Canaanites were known for their idolatry and wicked practices. By marrying someone from the Canaanite culture, there was a risk of compromising the faith and worship of the one true God. Thus, Abraham sought a wife for Isaac who shared their faith and would contribute to the continuation of the covenant line. Obedience and faithfulness. Abraham's servant, who was entrusted with the task of finding a wife for Isaac, emphasizes that he swore an oath to Abraham to fulfill his master's wishes, as found in Genesis chapter 24 verse 3. This highlights the importance of obedience and faithfulness in carrying out God-given tasks. The servant's commitment to fulfilling his master's instructions demonstrates his loyalty and devotion to his master and, ultimately, to God's plan. Application. While this passage specifically addresses the circumstances of finding a wife for Isaac, it carries broader principles that Christians can apply today. Believers are encouraged to seek godly relationships, whether in marriage or other partnerships, that align with their faith and values. It reminds us to be discerning and intentional when it comes to the important decisions of life, seeking God's guidance and remaining faithful to His principles. In summary, Genesis chapter 24 verse 37 highlights Abraham's insistence that Isaac should not marry a Canaanite woman but rather find a wife from his own people. This instruction serves to maintain the covenant line, preserve the purity of faith, and emphasize obedience and faithfulness. The passage provides valuable lessons on the importance of seeking godly relationships and faithfully carrying out God's instructions in our lives. Genesis chapter 24 verse 38. But thou shalt go unto my father's house, and to my kindred, and take a wife unto my son. Context. Genesis chapter 24 records the account of Abraham sending his servant to find a wife for his son Isaac. In this verse, Abraham instructs his servant to go to his homeland and find a wife for Isaac among his relatives. Importance of marriage. The verse highlights the significance of marriage in the biblical context. Abraham was concerned about finding a suitable wife for his son who would continue the covenantal lineage established by God. This emphasis on finding a godly spouse is seen throughout the Bible, as marriage plays a crucial role in God's plan for humanity. Godly relationships. Abraham's instructions reveal his desire for Isaac to marry someone from his own kindred. This demonstrates the importance of maintaining godly relationships within the family and community. The choice of a spouse should consider shared values, faith, and a commitment to serving God. Family blessing. Abraham wanted his son Isaac to be blessed through the marriage relationship. He understood that the choice of a wife would impact Isaac's future, his faith, and the fulfillment of God's promises to their family. This verse reminds us of the significance of seeking God's guidance and blessings in the formation of our own families. Trusting God's guidance. Abraham's servant, who was sent on this important mission, would later seek God's guidance to find the right woman for Isaac. Abraham's faith in God and trust in His guidance is evident in his instructions to his servant. This teaches us the importance of seeking God's wisdom and direction when making significant life decisions. Covenant continuity. Abraham's concern for finding a wife within his kindred reflected his desire to preserve and continue the covenant God had made with him. The promise of God's blessings and the fulfillment of his covenant were of utmost importance to Abraham. This verse underscores the significance of passing down godly values and faith to future generations. Foreshadowing of Christ and the Church. In the New Testament, the relationship between Christ and the Church is often depicted as a marriage. In the same way that Abraham sought a wife for Isaac, Jesus Christ, the Son of God, is seeking a bride, the Church, for himself. This verse can. Genesis chapter 24 verse 39. And I said unto my master, peradventure the woman will not follow me. Context. Genesis chapter 24 is the account of Abraham sending his servant to find a wife for his son, Isaac. In this verse, the servant is speaking to Abraham, recounting his journey and expressing his concern about the possibility of the woman not wanting to accompany him back to Canaan. Faithful service. Abraham's servant demonstrates his faithfulness and obedience to his master's command by embarking on a long journey to find a suitable wife for Isaac. This act of faithfulness and commitment is an example of the servant's dedication to fulfilling his master's will. As believers, we can learn from this servant's loyalty and willingness to carry out his assigned task. Perseverance in prayer. Before finding Rebekah, the servant prayed to God, asking for a specific sign to identify the right woman. In verse 12, he prays, O Lord God of my master Abraham, I pray thee, send me good speed this day, and show kindness unto my master Abraham. The servant's prayer demonstrates his dependence on God's guidance and his trust that God would lead him to the right woman. As followers of God, we can be encouraged to persist in prayer, seeking God's wisdom and guidance in all our endeavors. Trusting in God's providence. The servant's concern expressed in Genesis chapter 24 verse 39 reveals his uncertainty about the woman's willingness to leave her family and accompany him back to Canaan. Despite his apprehension, the servant ultimately trusts in God's providence to bring about the fulfillment of Abraham's request. This shows his confidence in God's ability to work in all circumstances and his willingness to surrender the outcome to God's sovereign control. Similarly, we are reminded to trust in God's providence and his faithfulness in fulfilling his promises. Divine guidance. Throughout the chapter, we see how God orchestrates the events to ensure that the servant finds the right woman. God answers the servant's prayer, and when he meets Rebekah, he recognizes God's hand at work. This emphasizes the importance of seeking God's guidance in our lives and being sensitive to his leading. God is actively involved in our lives, and as we trust and seek him, he will guide us along the right path. Application. This verse teaches us several valuable lessons, such as the importance of faithful service, perseverance in prayer, trusting in God's providence, and seeking divine guidance. It encourages us to trust in God's faithfulness and to be willing to surrender our plans and desires to his greater purpose. Remember, as you continue to study the Bible, it is beneficial to read the surrounding verses and chapters to gain a more comprehensive understanding of the context and the message being conveyed. Genesis chapter 24 verse 40. And he said unto me, The Lord, before whom I walk, will send his angel with thee, and prosper thy way. And thou shalt take a wife for my son of my kindred, and of my father's house. This verse is part of a narrative in the book of Genesis that recounts the story of Abraham's servant, who was sent on a mission to find a wife for Abraham's son, Isaac. In this particular verse, the servant is speaking to Rebekah's family, recounting how he sought guidance from God regarding the task he was given. Let's explore the significance of this verse in the context of the larger story and draw out some key themes and lessons we can learn from it. Divine guidance. The servant acknowledges that he received guidance from the Lord before embarking on his mission. He expresses his confidence that God will send an angel to accompany him and prosper his way. This verse highlights the importance of seeking divine guidance in our lives. It demonstrates that God is interested in and involved in the affairs of his people and is willing to guide them when they seek him. Trusting God's provision. The servant's trust in God's provision is evident in his words. He believes that God will prosper his journey and enable him to find a suitable wife for Isaac. This verse reminds us of the importance of trusting in God's provision and guidance in our own lives. It encourages us to have faith that God will provide for our needs and guide us on the right path. Covenant faithfulness. The servant is instructed to find a wife for Isaac from Abraham's kindred and father's house. This requirement is rooted in the covenant God made with Abraham, promising to bless his descendants. By emphasizing the need for a wife from Abraham's family, the verse highlights the significance of maintaining covenant faithfulness and preserving the spiritual heritage. It teaches us the importance of seeking godly relationships and partners who share our faith. God's care for His people. The verse suggests that God cares about the well-being and future of His people. The servant's mission is not merely a personal endeavor but is linked to God's larger plan for Abraham's family. It emphasizes God's concern for His people and His involvement in their lives. This can be a source of comfort and encouragement for us, knowing that God cares about our concerns and works in our lives for our good. In summary, Genesis chapter 24 verse 40 highlights the importance of seeking divine guidance, trusting in God's provision, maintaining covenant faithfulness, and recognizing God's care for His people. It offers valuable lessons for our own lives, reminding us to seek God's guidance, trust in His provision, prioritize godly relationships, and take comfort in His care for us. Genesis chapter 24 verse 41. Then shalt thou be clear from this my oath, when thou comest to my kindred, and if they give not thee one, thou shalt be clear from my oath. This verse is part of the account of Abraham's servant who was sent by Abraham to find a wife for his son, Isaac. The servant had traveled to Abraham's homeland to seek a suitable wife from among his own relatives. In this verse, the servant is speaking to Abraham's brother, Laban, and explaining his mission. To understand the context of this verse, we need to look at the larger story. In Genesis chapter 24, Abraham, who is advanced in years, desires to find a wife for his son Isaac. He makes his servant swear an oath to find a wife from among their own relatives and not from the Canaanites, among whom they were living. The servant is hesitant and concerned about finding the right woman, so he proposes a scenario to Abraham. In Genesis chapter 24 verse 41, the servant tells Laban that if Laban's family does not give him a suitable woman to marry Isaac, then the servant will be released from his oath. Essentially, the servant is saying that if Laban's family does not agree to the marriage proposal, he will not be bound by the oath he made to Abraham. This verse highlights the servant's concern about finding a woman who is willing to leave her family and come with him to marry Isaac. It also reveals the servant's reliance on God's guidance to fulfill his mission. He believes that if God does not provide a suitable wife from Abraham's kindred, then he will be released from his oath. Overall, this verse emphasizes the importance of fulfilling obligations and following God's leading. It also shows the servant's faith and trust in God's provision throughout his journey to find a wife for Isaac. Genesis chapter 24 verse 42. And I came this day unto the well, and said, O Lord God of my master Abraham, if now thou do prosper my way which I go. This verse is part of the narrative in Genesis chapter 24, which tells the story of how Abraham's servant was sent to find a wife for Isaac, Abraham's son. In this chapter, the servant travels to the city of Nahor in Mesopotamia, where he encounters Rebekah at a well. The servant then offers a prayer to God, expressing his desire for God to lead him to the right woman who would be suitable as a wife for Isaac. In verse 42, the servant is recounting the events to Rebekah's family and explains that on the day he arrived at the well, he prayed to the Lord God of my master Abraham, referring to Yahweh, the God of Israel, for success in his journey. The servant acknowledges God's role as the one who can prosper and guide his way. This verse highlights several important aspects of the story and provides some valuable insights. Trusting in God's guidance, the servant demonstrates a deep trust in God's guidance by seeking His favor in the journey. He acknowledges that success ultimately depends on God's intervention rather than his own efforts alone. This emphasizes the importance of relying on God's direction and seeking His will in our own lives. Recognizing God's authority, The servant refers to God as the Lord God of my master Abraham. This title acknowledges God's sovereignty and authority over Abraham and his household. It underscores the servant's recognition that he is accountable to God and seeks his blessing and favor in carrying out his duties. Prayer as a means of communication with God. The servant's prayer demonstrates the importance of prayer as a way to communicate with God. By lifting his request to God, the servant shows his dependence on him and his acknowledgement that God has the power to answer his prayer. God's providential care. The servant's request for God to prosper my way which I go reveals his awareness of God's providential care. He understands that his success in finding the right woman for Isaac is ultimately in God's hands. This highlights the belief in divine intervention and the recognition that God is involved in the details of our lives. Overall, Genesis chapter 24 verse 42 showcases the servant's trust in God's guidance, his acknowledgement of God's authority, and the importance of prayer and seeking God's will. It serves as a reminder for us to rely on God's wisdom and seek His direction in our own journeys, trusting in His providential care. Genesis chapter 24 verse 43. Behold, I stand by the well of water, and it shall come to pass, that when the virgin cometh forth to draw water, and I say to her, Give me, I pray thee, a little water of thy pitcher to drink. Context: Genesis chapter 24 tells the story of Abraham's servant who was sent to find a wife for Isaac, Abraham's son. In this verse, the servant is recounting his encounter with Rebekah, who offered to draw water from the well for him and his camels. Importance of the well. Wells held great significance in biblical times as a vital source of water in arid regions. They were also important gathering places where people met and socialized. In this context, the well is where the servant meets Rebekah, who becomes the chosen bride for Isaac. Observing the character of Rebekah, the servant identifies a particular sign in his search for a wife for Isaac. He expects that the chosen woman will not only offer him a drink but also willingly offer to water his camels. This would demonstrate her hospitality, kindness, and willingness to go the extra mile in serving others. Observing the faithfulness of God, the servant's presence at the well is not a mere coincidence but a divinely orchestrated encounter. God had guided Abraham's servant to the right place and at the right time, as he had prayed for guidance in finding a suitable wife for Isaac. This verse demonstrates God's faithfulness in answering prayers and leading His people. Symbolism: the act of drawing water from the well can be seen as a symbol of providing sustenance and refreshment. In a broader spiritual sense, it represents meeting the needs of others and displaying generosity and hospitality. Application: this verse challenges us to be attentive to God's leading and to trust in His guidance. Like Abraham's servant, we should seek God's wisdom and direction in our decision-making processes. Furthermore, it encourages us to cultivate qualities such as kindness, generosity, and hospitality in our interactions with others. Overall, Genesis chapter 24 verse 43 emphasizes the importance of God's providential guidance, the character of individuals, and the significance of hospitality and service. It reminds us to trust in God's faithfulness and to exhibit qualities that reflect His love and care for others. Genesis chapter 24 verse 44. And she says to me, Both drink thou, and I will also draw for thy camels. Let the same be the woman whom the Lord hath appointed out for my master's son. This verse is part of the account of Abraham's servant seeking a wife for Isaac. Let's explore the context and themes within this passage. In this chapter, Abraham's servant is sent on a mission to find a wife for Isaac from among Abraham's relatives. The servant prays to God for guidance and devises a test to identify the woman whom the Lord has appointed for Isaac. When he arrives at the town of Nahor, he encounters Rebekah at the well. The servant asks her for a drink, and she generously offers to draw water for his camels as well. Genesis chapter 24 verse 44 is part of the servant's account to Rebekah's family, where he explains his encounter with her at the well. The servant recounts how Rebekah not only offered him a drink but also volunteered to draw water for his camels. This act of kindness and hospitality stood out to the servant as a sign from God, indicating that Rebekah was the woman chosen by the Lord to be Isaac's wife. This verse reveals several themes that are significant within the broader context of the Bible. Divine providence. The story of Abraham's servant seeking a wife for Isaac highlights the belief in divine providence. The servant recognizes that God has orchestrated this encounter and is guiding his steps. The servant attributes Rebekah's actions to the Lord's appointment, indicating that God has a plan and is actively involved in the lives of his people. Hospitality and generosity. Rebekah's willingness to go above and beyond in showing kindness to a stranger and his camels is a testament to the value of hospitality in biblical culture. This act of generosity not only demonstrates Rebekah's character, but also emphasizes the importance of caring for others and showing hospitality, even to those we do not know. Marriage and God's guidance. The story of finding a wife for Isaac emphasizes the significance of seeking God's guidance in important decisions, particularly in the context of marriage. Abraham's servant sought the Lord's leading through prayer and received confirmation through Rebekah's actions. This narrative underscores the idea that God is interested in the details of our lives, including our relationships and marriages, and that seeking His guidance is essential. Overall, Genesis chapter 24 verse 44 portrays a pivotal moment in the story of Isaac and Rebekah, highlighting divine providence, hospitality, and the importance of seeking God's guidance in significant life decisions. It serves as a reminder of God's involvement in our lives and the value of extending kindness and generosity to others. Genesis chapter 24 verse 45. And before I had done speaking in mine heart, behold, Rebekah came forth with her pitcher on her shoulder, and she went down unto the well, and drew water, and I said unto her, Let me drink, I pray thee. This verse is part of the narrative in Genesis chapter 24, which tells the story of how Abraham's servant found a wife for Isaac. Abraham had sent his servant to his homeland to find a wife for Isaac from his own kin rather than from the Canaanites among whom they dwelled. In this particular verse, we see the servant recounting the events that occurred when he arrived at the well in Nahor. The servant had prayed to God, asking for a sign to help him identify the woman who would be suitable for Isaac. He had asked that the woman who offered him a drink and watered his camels be the chosen one. Before he had even finished speaking in his heart, Rebekah appeared with her pitcher on her shoulder, went down to the well, and drew water. The servant recognized this as a direct answer to his prayer. This verse highlights the faithfulness of God in answering prayers. The servant's request was specific, and God orchestrated the circumstances in a remarkable way to fulfill his servant's request. The timing was perfect, as Rebekah arrived just as the servant finished his prayer. This serves as a reminder that God is attentive to our prayers, even the ones we hold within our hearts, and He has the power to work through circumstances to fulfill His promises. Moreover, this verse also reveals Rebekah's character. She demonstrated kindness and hospitality by offering water to a stranger and his camels. This act of service and generosity played a crucial role in the servant's recognition of Rebekah as the chosen woman. It underscores the value of a humble and compassionate heart, qualities that Isaac would desire in a wife. In summary, Genesis chapter 24 verse 45 showcases the faithfulness of God in answering prayers and the importance of demonstrating kindness and hospitality. It reminds us that God is involved in the details of our lives and can orchestrate events to bring about His plans and fulfill His promises. Genesis chapter 24 verse 46. And she made haste, and let down her pitcher from her shoulder, and said, Drink, and I will give thy camels drink also. So I drank, and she made the camels drink also. This verse is part of the account of Abraham's servant's journey to find a wife for Isaac. In this chapter, Abraham had instructed his servant to go to his homeland and find a wife from among his relatives for his son Isaac, rather than taking a wife from the Canaanites among whom they lived. When the servant arrived in Nahor, he prayed to God for a specific sign to identify the woman who would be the chosen bride for Isaac. He requested that the woman who would offer to give him a drink from her pitcher and also water his camels be the one chosen by God. Rebekah, the daughter of Bethuel, who was Abraham's brother, appeared at the well as the servant was praying and fulfilled this sign. In verse 46, we see Rebekah's response to the servant's request. Rebekah not only gave the servant a drink but also offered to water his camels. This was a significant act of hospitality and kindness, as camels can drink a large amount of water. The verse highlights Rebekah's generous nature and willingness to go above and beyond to serve others. This passage teaches us several lessons. Hospitality and kindness. Rebekah's actions demonstrate the importance of showing hospitality and kindness to others. She willingly provided water not only for the servant but also for his camels, demonstrating her selflessness and generosity. Faithfulness in prayer. The servant's prayer for a specific sign was answered by God through Rebekah's arrival at the well. This serves as a reminder of the faithfulness of God in answering prayers and guiding us in our decisions. God's guidance in relationships. Abraham's servant sought God's guidance in finding a suitable wife for Isaac. Through the sign given and Rebekah's actions, it became clear that God had orchestrated their meeting. This emphasizes the importance of seeking God's guidance in our relationships and decisions, trusting that He will lead us in the right direction. Going above and beyond. Rebekah's willingness to provide water for the camels showed her dedication and willingness to go the extra mile. It serves as an example for us to exceed expectations and serve others with a joyful and generous heart. Overall, Genesis chapter 24 verse 46 showcases the virtue of hospitality, God's faithfulness in guiding our paths, and the significance of going beyond what is expected to serve others. Genesis chapter 24 verse 47. And I asked her, and said, Whose daughter art thou? And she said, The daughter of Bethuel, Nahor's son, whom Milcah bare unto him. And I put the earring upon her face, and the bracelets upon her hands. Genesis chapter 24 verse 47 is a verse from the narrative of Abraham's servant seeking a wife for Isaac. In this chapter, Abraham instructs his servant to find a wife for his son Isaac from among his relatives rather than from the Canaanites. The servant is concerned about finding the right woman, so he prays for God's guidance and sets out on a journey to Nahor, Abraham's hometown. Upon arriving in Nahor, the servant encounters Rebekah, who shows him great kindness by offering him water and offering to water his camels as well. Recognizing this as a sign from God, the servant blesses the Lord and decides to give Rebekah's family some gifts as a token of appreciation and respect. In verse 47, the servant asks Rebekah about her family background, specifically inquiring whose daughter she is. Rebekah responds by saying that she is the daughter of Bethuel, who is the son of Nahor, Abraham's brother. She also mentions that her mother's name is Milcah. Additionally, the verse mentions that the servant puts an earring upon Rebekah's face and bracelets upon her hands. This act symbolizes the servant's recognition of Rebekah as the chosen one and his desire to honor her with gifts. This verse highlights the servant's careful investigation and his desire to find a suitable wife for Isaac. It also shows Rebekah's willingness to engage with the servant and her readiness to accept his gifts. The servant's inquiry about Rebekah's lineage and the subsequent confirmation of her identity emphasize the importance of family ties and genealogy during that time. Overall, Genesis chapter 24 verse 47 underscores the providential leading of God in guiding the servant to Rebekah and provides insight into the customs and practices of the ancient Near Eastern culture. It also foreshadows the upcoming betrothal and eventual marriage of Isaac and Rebekah, as their story unfolds in subsequent verses. Genesis chapter 24 verse 48. And I bowed down my head, and worshipped the Lord, and blessed the Lord God of my master Abraham, which had led me in the right way to take my master's brother's daughter unto his son. Context: in Genesis chapter 24, Abraham's servant has been sent on a mission to find a wife for Isaac. He travels to the city of Nahor and prays to God, asking for a specific sign to guide him to the right woman. The servant is seeking God's guidance and provision throughout this process. Worship and recognition. In this verse, the servant describes his response to God's faithfulness and guidance. After the servant met Rebekah, who fulfilled the signs he had prayed for, he acknowledged God's leading by bowing down, worshipping the Lord, and blessing the Lord God of his master Abraham. Trusting in God's guidance, the servant recognized that it was God who had led him in the right way to find Rebekah, who would become Isaac's wife. The servant's prayer for a specific sign and his subsequent acknowledgement of God's faithfulness demonstrate his trust in God's guidance and provision in fulfilling his mission. Faith in God's promises. Abraham's servant had faith in God's promises to Abraham and believed that God would provide a suitable wife for Isaac. This faith is evident in his worship and acknowledgement of God's leading. Application. This verse reminds us of the importance of seeking God's guidance and trusting in his faithfulness. It encourages us to rely on God in our own decision-making processes and to give him praise and worship when we see his hand at work in our lives. In summary, Genesis chapter 24 verse 48 showcases the servant's response of worship and acknowledgement of God's guidance in finding Rebekah as a wife for Isaac. It highlights the servant's trust in God's faithfulness and his recognition of God's leading. This verse serves as a reminder for us to seek God's guidance, trust in his promises, and give him the praise he deserves when we see his hand at work in our lives. Genesis chapter 24 verse 49. And now if ye will deal kindly and truly with my master, tell me, and if not, tell me, that I may turn to the right hand, or to the left. This verse is part of the account of Abraham's servant who was sent by Abraham to find a wife for his son Isaac. The servant had arrived at the city of Nahor and encountered Rebekah, who demonstrated kindness and generosity towards him and his camels when he asked for a drink of water. Recognizing God's providence in leading him to Rebekah, the servant offered a prayer of gratitude to God. In this particular verse, the servant expresses his request to Rebekah's family, seeking their consent for Rebekah to marry Isaac. The servant, representing Abraham, was cautious and wanted to ensure that Rebekah's family would treat his master kindly and truthfully. He presented a conditional proposal, saying that if they would deal kindly and truly with his master, they should tell him, and if not, they should also inform him so that he could consider other options. This verse highlights the servant's diligence and concern for his master's well-being. He wanted to ensure that Isaac's future wife would be embraced by a family that would honor their commitment and treat her well. It also reflects the significance of faithfulness and integrity in relationships and agreements. In a broader sense, this verse can remind us of the importance of seeking God's guidance in our decision-making processes. Just as Abraham's servant sought confirmation and assurance from Rebekah's family, we should seek God's wisdom and discernment when making significant choices in our lives. Trusting in God's leading and seeking his will can help us make choices that align with his purpose and bring about blessings. Overall, Genesis chapter 24 verse 49 teaches us about the value of integrity, faithfulness, and seeking God's guidance in our relationships and decision-making processes. Genesis chapter 24 verse 50. Then Laban and Bethuel answered and said, The thing proceedeth from the Lord, we cannot speak unto thee bad or good. This verse is part of the narrative in Genesis that describes Abraham's servant's journey to find a wife for Isaac, his master's son. The servant, who is unnamed in the text, has been sent by Abraham to find a wife for Isaac from among Abraham's relatives rather than from the Canaanites. In this particular verse, Laban and Bethuel, who are relatives of Abraham, respond to the servant's request to take Rebekah, their sister, back with him to marry Isaac. The verse highlights their recognition that this matter is not solely a human decision but is influenced by God. Here are a few key points and themes that can be derived from Genesis chapter 24 verse 50. Divine providence. Laban and Bethuel acknowledge that the entire situation, including the servant's arrival and request, is orchestrated by God. They recognize that the matter proceedeth from the Lord, meaning that God is guiding and directing the events. This verse underscores the belief in divine intervention and emphasizes the role of God in human affairs. Trust in God's will. Laban and Bethuel's response shows their trust in God's plan. They express their willingness to comply with God's leading rather than relying on their own opinions or desires. Their recognition of God's involvement leads them to say, "We cannot speak unto thee bad or good." In other words, they acknowledge that they cannot oppose or reject what God has initiated. Submission to God's authority. Laban and Bethuel's statement reveals their submission to God's authority. By acknowledging that they cannot speak bad or good, they express their acceptance of the situation as divinely appointed and beyond their control. This highlights the importance of recognizing God's sovereignty and yielding to His will. Faith and obedience. Laban and Bethuel's response demonstrates faith and obedience. They trust that God's plan is for Rebekah to marry Isaac and are willing to comply with his directive. Their faith in God's guidance and their obedient response align with the overall theme of faithfulness seen throughout the book of Genesis. Overall, Genesis chapter 24 verse 50 illustrates the concept of divine providence, the need for trust in God's will, and the importance of submitting to His authority. It emphasizes the role of faith and obedience in carrying out God's purposes. Genesis chapter 24 verse 51. Behold, Rebekah is before thee, take her, and go, and let her be thy master's son's wife, as the Lord hath spoken. This verse is part of the narrative in Genesis chapter 24, which tells the story of how Abraham's servant found a wife for Isaac. In this chapter, Abraham instructs his servant to go to his homeland and find a wife for his son Isaac from among his relatives, rather than from the Canaanites among whom they lived. The servant sets out on his journey and prays to God for guidance and a sign. As the servant arrives in Nahor, he encounters Rebekah, who shows him great kindness and generosity by providing water for him and his camels. The servant recognizes that God has answered his prayer and led him to the right woman. After recounting the events of his journey, the servant concludes his speech in Genesis chapter 24 verse 51, addressing Rebekah's family, Behold, Rebekah is before thee, take her, and go, and let her be thy master's son's wife, as the Lord hath spoken. Let's explore some key aspects and lessons we can derive from this verse and the broader context of Genesis chapter 24, divine guidance. Throughout this chapter, we see the importance of seeking God's guidance and relying on His providence. Abraham's servant acknowledges that his success in finding a suitable wife for Isaac is a result of God's intervention and answered prayers. It serves as a reminder to trust in God's leading in our own lives and seek His guidance in our decision-making processes. Obedience to God's word. The servant's statement, "As the Lord hath spoken," highlights the servant's commitment to following God's instructions. Abraham had given his servant specific instructions, and the servant faithfully carried them out. This underscores the importance of obedience to God's word, both in the specific instructions given to us and in the broader principles and teachings found in Scripture. God's faithfulness. The fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham and the success of the servant's mission demonstrate God's faithfulness in orchestrating events according to His plan. God had promised Abraham that he would make his descendants into a great nation, and part of that plan involved Isaac having a wife from Abraham's own family. The servant's words affirm God's faithfulness in bringing about the intended outcome. Family and marriage. The verse also highlights the significance of family and marriage. In the cultural context of that time, the servant seeks permission from Rebekah's family to take her as Isaac's wife. This demonstrates respect for the family structure and the importance of familial relationships. It also highlights the significance of marriage as a covenantal relationship, rooted in God's design for companionship and procreation. Overall, Genesis chapter 24 verse 51 emphasizes the themes of divine guidance, obedience to God's word, God's faithfulness, and the significance of family and marriage. It reminds us of the importance of seeking God's leading in our lives, following His instructions, and recognizing His faithfulness in fulfilling His promises. Genesis chapter 24 verse 52. And it came to pass, that, when Abraham's servant heard their words, he worshipped the Lord, bowing himself to the earth. This verse is part of the narrative in Genesis chapter 24 that tells the story of Abraham's servant finding a wife for Isaac. Abraham had sent his servant to his homeland to find a wife among his relatives rather than from the local Canaanite women. In this specific verse, we see the servant's response after he had presented the gifts and explained the purpose of his visit to the family of Rebekah, who had been chosen as Isaac's potential wife. Upon hearing the words of the family members, the servant worships the Lord and bows down to the earth. This verse highlights a few important aspects worth exploring. Reverence for God. The servant's immediate response upon hearing the family's consent is to worship the Lord. This shows his deep reverence for God and acknowledges that God had guided and blessed his journey. The servant's act of worship is an expression of gratitude and recognition of God's presence in his life. Acknowledging God's guidance. Throughout Genesis chapter 24, we see how the servant sought God's guidance and direction. He had prayed to God for success in finding a suitable wife for Isaac, and now that his mission was seemingly accomplished, he acknowledges God's faithfulness and guidance by worshiping him. Humility. The servant's act of bowing down to the earth signifies humility and respect. His posture before God reflects his recognition of God's sovereignty and authority in his life. By bowing down, he acknowledges his position as a servant and affirms God's supremacy. This verse serves as a reminder of the importance of worship, gratitude, and humility in our relationship with God. It encourages us to acknowledge God's guidance and faithfulness in our lives and respond with reverence and adoration. Like the servant, we should seek to approach God with humility, recognizing his authority and surrendering ourselves to his will. Furthermore, this verse also portrays the servant as a faithful and obedient servant of Abraham. He carried out his master's instructions diligently and recognized the hand of God at work in his mission. This illustrates the servant's trust in his master and his willingness to fulfill his duties faithfully. As followers of God, we can learn from the servant's example of obedience and faithfulness in carrying out God's will in our lives. In conclusion, Genesis chapter 24 verse 52 reminds us of the servant's worshipful response upon hearing the family's consent to Isaac's marriage. It highlights the servant's reverence for God, his acknowledgement of God's guidance, and his display of humility before the Lord. This verse encourages us to cultivate an attitude of worship, gratitude, and obedience in our own lives as we seek to follow God's will. Genesis chapter 24 verse 5. And the servant brought forth jewels of silver, and jewels of gold, and raiment, and gave them to Rebekah. He gave also to her brother and to her mother precious things. This verse is part of the narrative in Genesis chapter 24, which recounts the story of Abraham's servant finding a wife for his son Isaac. In this chapter, Abraham sends his servant to his homeland to find a suitable wife from among his relatives for Isaac, rather than taking a wife from the local Canaanite people. When the servant arrives in Nahor, he encounters Rebekah, who shows kindness and hospitality by offering him and his camels water. The servant then realizes that Rebekah might be the one God has chosen for Isaac, and he decides to give her gifts as a token of his gratitude and as a sign of the seriousness of his request. In verse 53, we see that the servant presents Rebekah with jewels of silver, and jewels of gold, and raiment, as a gift. Additionally, he gives precious things to her brother and her mother. These gifts symbolize the servant's appreciation for Rebekah's kindness and serve as a form of compensation to her family for allowing her to leave and marry Isaac. This verse teaches us a few important lessons. Gratitude and generosity. The servant's act of giving gifts demonstrates gratitude for Rebekah's kindness. It reminds us of the importance of expressing gratitude for acts of kindness and going beyond mere words to demonstrate our appreciation. Generosity can create goodwill and foster positive relationships. Cultural context. The exchange of gifts in ancient Near Eastern cultures, including the time of Abraham, was a significant part of establishing agreements and alliances. The servant's gifts serve as a way to honor Rebekah's family and establish trust. Understanding the cultural context helps us grasp the significance of these actions. God's guidance. The events in this passage highlight God's guidance in fulfilling His promises. Abraham entrusted the task of finding a wife for Isaac to his servant, who relied on God's leading. The servant's encounter with Rebekah and the subsequent events demonstrate God's hand at work in orchestrating circumstances to accomplish His plans. Overall, Genesis chapter 24 verse 53 emphasizes the themes of gratitude, generosity, and trust in God's guidance. It encourages us to appreciate acts of kindness, be willing to give generously, and recognize that God can direct our paths in significant ways as we seek to fulfill His purposes. Genesis chapter 24 verse 54. And they did eat and drink, he and the men that were with him, and tarried all night. And they rose up in the morning, and he said, Send me away unto my master. Genesis chapter 24 verse 54 is a part of the narrative in which Abraham's servant is sent by Abraham to find a wife for his son Isaac. In this particular verse, we see the events following the servant's arrival at the house of Rebekah, who had been chosen as a potential wife for Isaac. Hospitality and provision. The verse begins by stating that they did eat and drink. It highlights the generous hospitality of Rebekah's family towards Abraham's servant and his companions. Hospitality was highly valued in the ancient Near Eastern culture, and offering food and drink was a way to show kindness and welcome to guests. Time spent. The verse continues, and tarried all night. After the meal, the servant and his men decided to spend the night at Rebekah's house. This further demonstrates the hospitality extended to them, as they were given accommodation for the night. Willingness to depart. The next part of the verse states, And they rose up in the morning, and he said, Send me away unto my master. Here, the servant expresses his desire to return to his master, Abraham. After accomplishing his mission and witnessing the signs from God confirming Rebekah as the chosen wife for Isaac, the servant is eager to fulfill his duty and bring Rebekah back to Canaan. Genesis chapter 24 verse 54 showcases several notable aspects, including the importance of hospitality, the provision of food and lodging, and the servant's readiness to complete his mission. This passage also sets the stage for the subsequent events, where the servant seeks permission to take Rebekah and return to Isaac, ultimately leading to their marriage. It is worth noting that the Bible contains many rich stories and teachings, and a comprehensive Bible study often involves examining the broader context, historical background, and related passages. Genesis chapter 24 verse 55. And her brother and her mother said, Let the damsel abide with us a few days, at the least 10. After that she shall go. This verse is part of the narrative in Genesis chapter 24, which recounts the story of how Abraham sent his servant to find a wife for his son Isaac. The servant traveled to Abraham's homeland and arrived at the city of Nahor. There, he encountered Rebekah, who displayed kindness and hospitality by providing water for him and his camels. The servant then learned that Rebekah was from the family of Abraham's brother Nahor. In verse 55, Rebekah's family members, her brother, and her mother, respond to the servant's request for Rebekah to accompany him back to Canaan and marry Isaac. They initially express a desire for Rebekah to stay with them for a few more days, specifically for a period of at least 10 days, before allowing her to leave. This delay might have been to ensure that Rebekah had ample time to say her goodbyes and prepare for the journey. This verse highlights the importance of family dynamics and their involvement in marriage decisions during that time. Rebekah's family had the authority to determine her future, and their agreement was necessary for her to leave and marry Isaac. In ancient Near Eastern cultures, it was customary for families to play a significant role in arranging marriages, ensuring compatibility, and negotiating the terms of the union. Genesis chapter 24, as a whole, demonstrates God's faithfulness in orchestrating events to fulfill His promise to Abraham. Through the servant's journey and the subsequent marriage of Isaac and Rebekah, God's plan for the continuation of His covenant with Abraham is set in motion. The story showcases the importance of seeking God's guidance and trusting in His providence in matters of significant decisions, such as marriage. While this verse may not contain explicit theological teachings, it provides insights into the cultural practices of the time and serves as a backdrop for the larger narrative of God's redemptive plan. It also reminds us of the significance of familial relationships and the responsibility of families to consider and participate in important life choices. Genesis chapter 24 verse 56. And he said unto them, Hinder me not, seeing the Lord hath prospered my way, send me away that I may go to my master. This verse is part of the narrative of Abraham's servant who was sent on a mission to find a wife for Isaac, Abraham's son. In Genesis chapter 24, Abraham instructs his servant to go to his country and his kindred to find a suitable wife for Isaac. The servant swears an oath to fulfill this task faithfully. As the servant arrives at his destination, he encounters Rebekah, who fulfills the specific signs he had prayed for, indicating that she is the chosen wife for Isaac. In Genesis chapter 24 verse 56, the servant expresses his desire to depart and return to his master, Abraham, with Rebekah. His words, "Hinder me not," reflect his eagerness to fulfill his duty and complete the mission entrusted to him by Abraham. The servant recognizes the hand of the Lord in his journey, acknowledging that God had prospered his way. This acknowledgement indicates the servant's faith in God's guidance and providence throughout the entire process. The servant's words reveal a profound understanding of God's involvement in the affairs of His people. He attributes the successful outcome of his journey not to his own abilities or strategies, but to the Lord's blessings and guidance. This perspective emphasizes the importance of relying on God and acknowledging His sovereignty in our lives. In our own lives, we can draw lessons from Genesis chapter 24 verse 56. First, it reminds us to seek God's guidance in all our endeavors. The servant's recognition of God's hand in his journey serves as a reminder that we should not rely solely on our own understanding, but rather acknowledge God's wisdom and direction. When we involve God in our plans and decisions, we can trust that He will guide us along the right path. Secondly, the servant's words teach us about the importance of faithfulness and obedience. The servant's commitment to fulfill his duty to find a wife for Isaac demonstrates his loyalty to his master, Abraham. Similarly, as believers, we are called to be faithful and obedient to God's commands. By following God's instructions and remaining committed to His purposes, we can experience His blessings and fulfill the tasks He has set before us. Lastly, Genesis chapter 24 verse 56 encourages us to recognize and give credit to God for His providence and blessings. Like the servant, we should acknowledge that our successes and achievements are ultimately a result of God's grace and favor. It cultivates an attitude of gratitude and humility, recognizing that our abilities and opportunities are gifts from God. In conclusion, Genesis chapter 24 verse 56 offers valuable insights into the servant's faith, his acknowledgement of God's guidance, and his eagerness to fulfill his mission. It teaches us to seek God's guidance, to be faithful and obedient, and to give credit to God for His blessings in our lives. By applying these principles, we can grow in our own faith journey and experience the fulfillment of God's purposes in our lives. Genesis chapter 24 verse 57. And they said, We will call the damsel, and inquire at her mouth. In this verse, we find the story of Abraham's servant who was sent to find a wife for Isaac, Abraham's son. Let's explore the significance of this verse and its broader context. Context: Genesis chapter 24. Genesis chapter 24 recounts the account of Abraham's servant seeking a bride for Isaac. Abraham instructs his servant to travel to his homeland to find a suitable wife from among his relatives. The servant prays for God's guidance and devises a test to find the right woman. He meets Rebekah at a well and recognizes her as the chosen one. After receiving her family's consent, the servant presents gifts to Rebekah and her family. Cultural significance: in ancient Hebrew culture, marriage arrangements were typically negotiated by the families involved. It was important to involve the opinions and desires of the prospective bride and groom. In this context, we see the family members discussing the matter and seeking the damsel's, Rebekah's, input before making a final decision. Importance of consent. The phrase, "and inquire at her mouth," in Genesis chapter 24 verse 57 highlights the significance of consent and the respect given to Rebekah's opinion. Rather than making a unilateral decision, the family members acknowledge her role in the process and value her consent. This demonstrates a cultural norm of seeking the consent and agreement of the prospective bride in the marriage arrangement. Lessons for today. Genesis chapter 24 verse 57 teaches us several important lessons. Respect for individual agency. The passage encourages us to respect the agency and desires of individuals, particularly in matters that significantly impact their lives. It emphasizes the importance of considering their opinions and seeking their consent. Family involvement. The involvement of Rebekah's family in the decision-making process highlights the value of family input and support in significant life choices. It is a reminder of the importance of seeking counsel from wise and trusted family members. God's guidance. Throughout the entire chapter, we witness the servant seeking God's guidance in prayer. This serves as a reminder for us to seek God's wisdom and direction in our own decision-making processes, especially in matters as important as marriage. God's faithfulness. The chapter as a whole demonstrates God's faithfulness in fulfilling His promises to Abraham. The servant's journey and his encounter with Rebekah illustrate God's providential guidance and involvement in the details of our lives. In summary, Genesis chapter 24 verse 57 portrays a cultural practice of seeking the damsel's opinion and consent in a marriage arrangement. It reminds us of the importance of respecting individual agency, involving families in significant decisions, seeking God's guidance, and trusting in God's faithfulness. Genesis chapter 24 verse 58. And they called Rebekah, and said unto her, Wilt thou go with this man? And she said, I will go. This verse is part of the narrative in Genesis chapter 24, which tells the story of how Abraham's servant was sent to find a wife for Isaac, Abraham's son. In this chapter, the servant travels to the land of Abraham's relatives to find a suitable wife from among his people. After arriving, he encounters Rebekah, who shows kindness and hospitality to him and his camels. In Genesis chapter 24 verse 58, the servant and Rebekah's family are discussing the matter of Rebekah leaving with the servant to marry Isaac. This verse captures the pivotal moment when the decision is made. The family asks Rebekah if she is willing to go with the servant, and her response is a simple and straightforward declaration, I will go. There are a few key themes and lessons we can draw from this verse. Willingness to follow. Rebekah's willingness to go with the servant demonstrates her faith and trust in God's plan. She agrees to leave her family, her familiar surroundings, and embark on a journey to a new land to marry a man she has never met. Her response exemplifies a readiness to follow God's leading even when it requires stepping into the unknown. Obedience and submission. Rebekah's affirmation of her willingness to go shows her obedience to her family and their decision, as well as her submission to God's divine guidance. In the biblical context, wives were often chosen by their families, and Rebekah's response indicates her respect and compliance with her family's arrangement. God's providential guidance. Throughout the story in Genesis chapter 24, it is evident that God's providence is at work. The servant is guided to Rebekah, and her response aligns with God's plan. This verse highlights the belief that God orchestrates events in our lives and leads us in His purposes. Commitment and trust in marriage. Rebekah's commitment to marry Isaac is seen in her willingness to leave her family and home. It reveals her trust in God's provision for her future and her commitment to the marriage covenant. Her response emphasizes the importance of trust and faithfulness in marriage. Overall, Genesis chapter 24 verse 58 showcases Rebekah's faith, obedience, and trust in God's plan. It also teaches us the value of being willing to follow God's leading, being obedient to His guidance, and committing to His purposes even in uncertain circumstances. Genesis chapter 24 verse 59. And they sent away Rebekah their sister, and her nurse, and Abraham's servant, and his men. This verse is part of the narrative in Genesis chapter 24 that recounts the story of how Isaac, the son of Abraham, obtained a wife named Rebekah. In this particular verse, we witness the departure of Rebekah from her family to accompany Abraham's servant and his men to meet Isaac. To fully understand the significance of this verse, it's important to examine the context. In the preceding verses, we learn that Abraham was concerned about finding a suitable wife for his son Isaac. He did not want Isaac to marry one of the Canaanite women among whom they lived. Instead, Abraham desired a wife for Isaac from his own family, specifically from his relatives in Mesopotamia. Abraham sent his servant, who is not named in the text but traditionally believed to be Eliezer, to find a wife for Isaac. The servant journeyed to the city of Nahor in Mesopotamia and encountered Rebekah at the well. He recognized her as a potential wife for Isaac because of her kindness and willingness to draw water for him and his camels. After negotiations with Rebekah's family, they agreed to let Rebekah marry Isaac. In verse 59, we see the moment when Rebekah's family bids her farewell. They send away Rebekah, her nurse, a trusted caretaker or companion, the servant Eliezer, and his men. This departure marks the beginning of Rebekah's journey to meet Isaac and become his wife. The significance of this verse lies in the obedience and faithfulness displayed by Rebekah and her family. Despite the emotional attachment and the potential challenges of sending their daughter away, they honored their commitment and entrusted her to the servant of Abraham, trusting in God's guidance and provision. This act exemplifies the importance of faith and trust in God's plan and the belief that He will work out His purposes through our lives. Additionally, this verse highlights the theme of divine providence. The entire story of Rebekah's encounter with the servant, her family's agreement, and her subsequent journey to marry Isaac unfolds under the guidance and intervention of God. It emphasizes God's faithfulness in orchestrating events to fulfill His promises and establish the lineage through which the Messiah would eventually come. In conclusion, Genesis chapter 24 verse 59 captures the departure of Rebekah from her family to join Isaac as his wife. It showcases the obedience and trust displayed by Rebekah and her family, as well as the overarching theme of divine providence throughout the narrative. This verse serves as a reminder of the importance of faith and surrendering to God's plan, even when it involves letting go of our own desires and trusting in His guidance. Genesis chapter 24 verse 6 (tie). And they blessed Rebekah, and said unto her, Thou art our sister, be thou the mother of thousands of millions, and let thy seed possess the gate of those which hate them. This verse is part of the account of Abraham's servant's journey to find a wife for Isaac, Abraham's son. The servant had been sent to Abraham's homeland to find a suitable wife among his relatives rather than among the Canaanites. In this verse, Rebekah's family blesses her as she prepares to leave and marry Isaac. Let's break down the verse to understand its significance and the themes it touches upon. And they blessed Rebekah. The word blessed here carries the idea of speaking well of someone or pronouncing a positive future for them. Rebekah's family gives her their blessing as she embarks on this new chapter of her life. Thou art our sister. This phrase signifies the familial relationship between Rebekah and her family. It highlights the importance of family ties and the care they have for her. Be thou the mother of thousands of millions. This part of the blessing expresses a desire for Rebekah to be fruitful and multiply, indicating the hope that she will have many descendants. Let thy seed possess the gate of those which hate them. This phrase is significant in its prophetic nature. It speaks of Rebekah's descendants possessing the gates of those who hate them. In biblical times, the gates of a city were places of strategic importance and power. Possessing the gate implies gaining authority, influence, and control over one's enemies. This blessing suggests that Rebekah's offspring would be victorious over their adversaries. The overall message of this verse is one of blessing, hope, and prophetic declaration. It showcases the importance of family, the desire for Rebekah's fruitful lineage, and the confidence in her descendants' triumph over their enemies. It is worth noting that while this verse carries specific historical and cultural context within the narrative of Rebekah's marriage, its broader significance lies in the blessings and promises conveyed through the spoken words. Throughout the Bible, blessings and prophecies play a vital role in conveying God's plans for individuals and the fulfillment of His promises. Genesis chapter 24 verse 61. And Rebekah arose, and her damsels, and they rode upon the camels, and followed the man. And the servant took Rebekah, and went his way. Genesis chapter 24 verse 61 is part of the narrative of Abraham's servant seeking a wife for Isaac. In this chapter, Abraham sends his trusted servant to his homeland to find a suitable wife among his relatives for his son Isaac, who was not to marry a Canaanite woman. The servant's journey brings him to the city of Nahor, where he encounters Rebekah, who demonstrates kindness and generosity by offering to water the servant's camels. Now, let's examine the verse in more detail. And Rebekah arose. This phrase signifies Rebekah's readiness and willingness to go with the servant. It shows her obedience and faithfulness in leaving her family to join Isaac, whom she had not yet met. It also suggests her trust in the servant as a representative of Abraham and God's will. And her damsels, this refers to Rebekah's female attendants or maidservants who accompanied her. It highlights Rebekah's status and the support she had for the journey. They rode upon the camels. This indicates that Rebekah and her damsels traveled on camels, a common mode of transportation in that era. Camels were well suited for long journeys across the desert, providing a means of travel with their endurance and ability to carry heavy loads. And followed the man. Rebekah and her damsels followed the servant who had come to seek her as a potential wife for Isaac. This shows Rebekah's trust in the servant's judgment and guidance as they embarked on the journey. And the servant took Rebekah, and went his way. The servant took Rebekah with him and continued on their journey back to Abraham's land. This emphasizes the fulfillment of the servant's mission and the acceptance of Rebekah as Isaac's future wife. This verse highlights several significant themes: obedience and trust. Rebekah's willingness to arise and follow the servant demonstrates her obedience to her family and her trust in God's guidance. God's providence. The entire story of finding a wife for Isaac illustrates God's providential care in orchestrating events to fulfill His purposes. God led the servant to Rebekah and ensured the success of his mission. Faithfulness and commitment. Rebekah's commitment to leave her family and homeland to marry Isaac reflects her faithfulness to the divine plan and her willingness to fulfill her role in God's covenant with Abraham. Overall, Genesis chapter 24 verse 61 showcases the faith, obedience, and trust displayed by Rebekah as she embarks on a journey to become Isaac's wife, playing a significant role in God's unfolding plan for the nation of Israel. Genesis chapter 24 verse 62. And Isaac came from the way of the well Lahairoi, for he dwelt in the south country. Genesis chapter 24 verse 62 is a relatively short verse that appears in the narrative of the book of Genesis, specifically in the context of the story of Isaac and Rebekah. To understand its significance, let's examine the broader context. Genesis chapter 24 recounts the account of Abraham's servant, who was entrusted with finding a wife for Isaac. Abraham sent the servant to his homeland to find a suitable bride from his own people rather than from the Canaanites, among whom they were dwelling. The servant was led by God to Rebekah, who showed exceptional hospitality and willingness to fulfill the servant's request. Recognizing God's guidance, the servant bowed down and worshipped the Lord. In Genesis chapter 24 verse 62, we learn that Isaac, who had been dwelling in the southern region of Canaan, returned from the way of the well Lahairoi. This particular well was significant because it was near Beersheba, where Hagar encountered the angel of the Lord after fleeing from Sarah, Abraham's wife, in Genesis chapter 16 verse 14. The well was named Lahairoi, meaning, the well of the living one who sees me, in reference to Hagar's encounter with God. Isaac's return from the well Lahairoi indicates that he was likely spending time in prayer and communion with God. It highlights his connection to the faith of his father, Abraham, and his acknowledgement of God's presence and guidance in his life. This verse serves as a subtle reminder that Isaac, too, sought God's will and direction in his actions. Overall, Genesis chapter 24 verse 62 emphasizes Isaac's faith and his commitment to seeking God's presence. It reveals the spiritual dimension of Isaac's character and his desire to align his life with God's plans and purposes. This verse also sets the stage for the subsequent events in Isaac's life, including his meeting with Rebekah, who would become his wife. As with any passage of Scripture, it is beneficial to consider the historical and cultural context, as well as the surrounding verses, to gain a more comprehensive understanding of the passage and its implications. Genesis chapter 24 verse 63. And Isaac went out to meditate in the field at the eventide, and he lifted up his eyes, and saw, and, behold, the camels were coming. This verse provides a brief glimpse into the life of Isaac, the son of Abraham, and offers some insights into the spiritual practice of meditation. Let's explore this verse in more detail and consider its significance. Isaac's activity. The verse begins by telling us that Isaac went out to meditate in the field at the eventide. Isaac sought a quiet and serene place to spend time alone in contemplation and prayer. The mention of the eventide suggests that he engaged in this practice towards the end of the day, perhaps during sunset or twilight. Meditation. The act of meditation involves deep contemplation, reflection, and connection with one's thoughts, feelings, and spirituality. Isaac's decision to meditate reveals his desire for communion with God and a willingness to seek solace and guidance in prayerful reflection. This practice allowed Isaac to detach from his daily concerns and open himself to divine inspiration. Observing, as Isaac was engaged in his meditation, he lifted up his eyes and saw the arrival of camels. This suggests that while he was deep in thought, he remained attentive to his surroundings. Isaac's ability to perceive the approaching camels indicates that his spiritual practice did not isolate him from the world but rather enhanced his awareness. Context. Genesis chapter 24 narrates the account of Abraham sending his servant to find a wife for Isaac. In this chapter, the servant meets Rebekah near a well and eventually brings her back to Isaac. The mention of the camels in verse 63 signifies the imminent arrival of the servant and Rebekah, as they traveled with the camels. Isaac's meditation in the field preceded this significant event in his life. Lessons. Genesis chapter 24 verse 63 teaches us several valuable lessons. First, it underscores the importance of taking time for personal reflection and spiritual practices. Isaac's intentional choice to meditate suggests a desire for communion with God and the need to seek guidance and inner peace. Second, the verse emphasizes the value of remaining attentive and open to divine encounters even in the midst of our spiritual practices. Isaac's ability to notice the camels while meditating demonstrates the integration of spirituality and awareness of the world around him. In conclusion, Genesis chapter 24 verse 63 offers a glimpse into Isaac's practice of meditation and highlights the importance of personal reflection, communion with God, and remaining attentive to divine encounters. It encourages us to cultivate a similar habit of seeking moments of solitude and reflection to connect with our spirituality and find guidance in our lives. Genesis chapter 24 verse 64. And Rebekah lifted up her eyes, and when she saw Isaac, she lighted off the camel. Context. Genesis chapter 24 narrates the story of how Abraham sent his servant to find a wife for his son Isaac. The servant, guided by God, came to the land of Abraham's relatives. He prayed for a sign, and God answered by bringing Rebekah to the well. Rebekah agreed to go with the servant to meet Isaac, and as they approached, she saw him. Importance of lifting up her eyes. In this verse, Rebekah lifted up her eyes when she saw Isaac. This phrase signifies a significant moment of anticipation and expectation. It suggests that Rebekah was eagerly looking forward to meeting Isaac and was ready to take the next step in her life. Symbolism. Rebekah's action of lifting up her eyes can be seen as symbolic of looking beyond the present circumstances and focusing on the future promises and blessings. She had left her home and family to embark on a journey of faith, guided by the servant who represented God's guidance. When she saw Isaac, it was a realization of God's faithfulness and the beginning of a new chapter in her life. Isaac's significance. Isaac holds an important role in the biblical narrative as the promised son of Abraham and Sarah. He is a type of Christ, foreshadowing Jesus' role as the beloved son who would bring salvation. Rebekah's encounter with Isaac can be seen as a foreshadowing of the relationship between Christ, the bridegroom, and the church, the bride. Application. Rebekah's response teaches us important lessons about faith and obedience. She demonstrated faith by leaving her family and trusting God's guidance. She displayed obedience by willingly following the servant's instructions. Similarly, in our lives, we are called to trust in God's guidance, even when it requires stepping out of our comfort zones. Rebekah's example encourages us to lift up our eyes, look to the promises of God, and respond with faith and obedience. In conclusion, Genesis chapter 24 verse 64 showcases Rebekah's eager anticipation and excitement as she lifts up her eyes and sees Isaac. This verse highlights the faith, obedience, and trust in God's guidance demonstrated by Rebekah. It also carries symbolic significance, pointing to the relationship between Christ and the church. We can apply this passage to our own lives by learning from Rebekah's example of faith and obedience. Genesis chapter 24 verse 65. And she said unto the servant, What man is this that walketh in the field to meet us? And the servant had said, It is my master. Therefore she took a veil, and covered herself. Genesis chapter 24 verse 65 is part of the narrative that describes how Isaac, the son of Abraham, found a wife named Rebekah. In this particular verse, Rebekah sees Isaac approaching, and she asks the servant who the man is. The servant informs her that it is his master, Isaac, and as a sign of respect and modesty, Rebekah covers herself with a veil. This verse highlights several themes and lessons that we can draw from modesty and respect. Rebekah's act of covering herself with a veil when she sees Isaac demonstrates cultural norms of modesty and respect. It reflects her recognition of Isaac's position as her future husband and shows her desire to honor him. Obedience and trust. Rebekah's obedience to her family's wishes to marry Isaac is evident in her journey to meet him. Her trust in her family and the servant is also displayed by following their guidance throughout the encounter. Divine guidance. This verse is part of a larger narrative in Genesis chapter 24 that emphasizes God's providence and guidance in the selection of Isaac's wife. Abraham had sent his servant to find a wife for Isaac, and the servant had prayed for a specific sign from God. Rebekah's appearance and her actions aligning with the servant's prayer demonstrate God's involvement in orchestrating this union. Foreshadowing of Christ and the Church. Some biblical scholars draw parallels between this passage and the relationship between Christ and the Church. Isaac is seen as a type of Christ, and Rebekah as a type of the Church. The veiling of Rebekah can symbolize the Church's submission and modesty before Christ, her bridegroom. It's important to note that different interpretations and lessons can be drawn from Bible verses, and the above points provide a starting point for reflection. As you study the Bible, it can be helpful to consult commentaries, study guides, and engage in prayerful reflection to gain a deeper understanding of the text. Genesis chapter 24 verse 66. And the servant told Isaac all things that he had done. This verse is found in the context of the narrative of Abraham sending his servant to find a wife for his son Isaac. The servant had journeyed to the city of Nahor in Mesopotamia and encountered Rebekah at the well. After receiving confirmation that she was the chosen woman, the servant presented gifts to her and her family, and they agreed to let Rebekah marry Isaac. In Genesis chapter 24 verses 62 through 65, Rebekah is brought to meet Isaac, and the verse in question, Genesis chapter 24 verse 66, follows this meeting. This verse seems relatively simple and straightforward, but it carries significance within the broader story. It serves as a transition point, highlighting the completion of the servant's task and the fulfillment of Abraham's instructions. The servant recounts to Isaac all the details of his journey, the encounter with Rebekah, and the events leading to her arrival. In a broader sense, this verse reflects the importance of communication and the sharing of information. The servant's report ensures that Isaac is aware of the servant's faithfulness in carrying out Abraham's command. It also establishes a foundation of trust between Isaac and Rebekah, as Isaac is now informed of the servant's successful mission and the circumstances surrounding Rebekah's arrival. From a spiritual perspective, this verse can remind us of the significance of sharing our experiences and testimonies with one another. Just as the servant shared his journey and the events with Isaac, we are called to share our faith experiences, lessons, and encounters with God with fellow believers. Such sharing can strengthen relationships, build trust, and encourage one another in our own faith journeys. Overall, Genesis chapter 24 verse 66 provides a crucial moment in the narrative, signifying the completion of the servant's task and the beginning of Isaac and Rebekah's journey together. It also reminds us of the value of open communication and sharing our experiences with others in our own spiritual walk. Genesis chapter 24 verse 67. And Isaac brought her into his mother Sarah's tent, and took Rebekah, and she became his wife, and he loved her, and Isaac was comforted after his mother's death. This verse is found at the conclusion of the story of how Isaac's wife, Rebekah, was chosen for him by his father Abraham's servant. It marks the beginning of Isaac and Rebekah's marriage and highlights Isaac's love for his wife, bringing comfort to him after the passing of his mother, Sarah. Context. To understand the significance of Genesis chapter 24 verse 67, it's essential to review the context of the verse. In Genesis chapter 24, Abraham sends his servant to find a wife for Isaac from among his relatives, rather than taking a Canaanite woman. The servant, guided by God's providence, encounters Rebekah at a well, where she displays qualities of kindness and generosity. The servant believes she is the one chosen by God for Isaac, and he brings her back to Isaac. Isaac's mother's tent. In verse 67, it mentions that Isaac brought Rebekah into his mother Sarah's tent. Sarah, Isaac's mother, had died before this event. Isaac's decision to bring Rebekah into his mother's tent symbolizes the transfer of authority, blessings, and promises from one generation to the next. It signifies Rebekah assuming the role and responsibilities of a matriarch. Becoming his wife, the verse also states that Isaac took Rebekah, and she became his wife. This emphasizes the significance of marriage as a sacred and binding covenant in biblical times. It highlights the union between Isaac and Rebekah, solidifying their commitment to each other before God. Isaac's love and comfort. Genesis chapter 24 verse 67 notes that Isaac loved Rebekah, which suggests that their marriage was founded on affection and care. Additionally, it mentions that Isaac was comforted after his mother's death. The loss of Sarah, Isaac's mother, was undoubtedly a significant event in his life. Rebekah's presence and love brought solace and consolation to Isaac during this period of grief. Lessons and application. Genesis chapter 24 verse 67 teaches several valuable lessons. It highlights the importance of choosing a spouse who shares the same faith and values. Isaac's servant diligently sought a wife for Isaac from Abraham's family, illustrating the significance of preserving a godly lineage. It also emphasizes the role of marriage in providing comfort and support during times of loss or adversity. Moreover, this verse reminds us of the passing of generational blessings and responsibilities. As Rebekah entered Sarah's tent, it symbolized the continuation of God's promises and covenant from one generation to the next. In conclusion, Genesis chapter 24 verse 67 captures the moment Isaac brings Rebekah into his mother's tent, signifying their marriage and Isaac's love for his new wife. It also highlights the comfort Rebekah brought to Isaac following the death of his mother. This verse encourages us to seek godly relationships, honors the significance of marriage, and reminds us of the passing of generational blessings and responsibilities.